Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, we're going to do a deep dive where we're going to go into and explain the meaning and the characteristics associated with the zodiac sign Sagittarius. So joining me today are astrologers Ashley Paris and Rob Bailey. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you
Chris.
for having us.
Hey, thanks for joining me today on this episode. This is the 9th installment in my series on the signs of the zodiac, where we've been doing a deep dive through each of the signs. In the last episode, we did the arguably best sign of the zodiac, which is Scorpio. And now we're moving on to the later signs of the zodiac, which are, they're okay. They're up there in terms of like good signs. I think you'd both agree.
I mean, I
Yeah.
would say Sag is number one, and maybe Scorpio can take second, but
I'm a fan of
No.
Scorpio, but I have my own preferences.
All right. I think this episode is over. I think we're done here.
I'm Sag and I know my truth, Chris.
All right. Well, you stick to those convictions. We're going to talk a lot about that, a lot about belief, conviction, and different things like that in this episode. So first, let me give the data. So today is Sunday, December 4th, 2022, looks like I started at 2:17 or 2:18 p.m. in Denver, Colorado. And this is episode 379 of the Astrology Podcast. So where I usually start with these episodes is first talking about the credentials of my guests, because with each of these episodes, I've been trying to have one or two astrologers on that have heavy placements in the signs that we're talking about, or have some placements in their birth chart in those signs. So I wanted to first ask you what placements you have in Sagittarius and what your Sagittarius credentials are for this episode. Which one of you wants to start?
Maybe I'm Aries rising, so I might jump in and go first, Chris. How's that sound?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So do you feel comfortable sharing your chart?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right, here we go. So for the audio listeners, Rob's chart has late Aries rising, and you have the Sun, Mercury, Neptune, and Uranus all in the sign of Sagittarius.
Yeah, it's a bit of a stellium when you chuck in those outer planets. But yeah, Sun and Mercury conjunct in Sag does sort of focus it all in there a bit. And I do have the ruler of my rising sign, Aries, in Virgo as well, which maybe balances the Sagittarius qualities out a little bit.
Nice. I like that. That's good. As well as some air signs with Venus in Aquarius on the sign of the degree of the midheaven, the moon in Gemini, and Saturn and Pluto around the descendant in Libra in the 7th house.
Yeah, I'm almost entirely air and fire, but that Mars in Virgo is doing a lot of work to keep me grounded.
Right. And then Jupiter in Scorpio.
Yes, as well. Yeah, absolutely. So where all that Sagittarius stuff is going is into Scorpio. So perhaps that explains some of my like esoteric interests and maybe my like slightly darker sense of humor, perhaps.
Right. All right. Ashley, what about you? What are your credentials?
I'm a Sag sun, and I have my North Node in Sagittarius as well. It's not quite a stellium, but I feel like they're still pretty powerful, and everywhere I go, everyone picks up on the Sag energy for sure.
Nice. So for the audio listeners, you have late Taurus rising, and you have the Sun at 9 degrees of Sag and the North Node at 21 degrees of Sag in the 8th whole sign house.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. Your chart, I always tell you your chart looks very familiar, both because you have the same moon in Aquarius and Mercury in Scorpio as me, but also I think your chart looks very similar to another guest, Becca Tarnas, who also has like the Sun in Sag, Taurus rising, Mercury in Scorpio, and moon in Aquarius.
Mm-hmm. And I love that astrologers have that kind of overlap. You tend to like be drawn to people, I think, sometimes that have similar placements. And Rob, I noticed that he has midheaven in Aquarius, and so do I.
That's a good point.
There you go.
Interesting. Okay, good. All right. Well, I think those are pretty good credentials. I think you can both speak pretty authoritatively for the sign as representatives of the sign of Sagittarius here. So let me put up some graphics for those watching the video version of this. So first I want to start with the image from our poster, which shows the signs of the zodiac and their basic qualities. We started way back in Aries earlier this year, which is the first sign of the zodiac after the vernal equinox. And now we're all the way up to Jupiter, which is the last sign of the zodiac just before the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere. So in terms of the credentials for Jupiter, or for Sagittarius, I should say, Sagittarius, the word, the Greek term meant the archer, and that's part of the glyph for Sagittarius, is it's usually stylized as a sort of arrow that's being shot up into the air. In terms of its other stats, Sagittarius is a masculine or diurnal sign. It's said to be a fire sign, or it's said to be fiery. It's a mutable sign. It's one of the 4 mutable signs in terms of modality or quadruplicity. Also, in the Stoic element, said to be a hot sign because it's a fire sign, and fire rises upwards to the uppermost limits of the cosmos. In terms of the sign rulers and the dignities, Sagittarius is said to be ruled by the planet Jupiter, and it's said to be the sign of the detriment or antithesis of Mercury because it's opposite to one of Mercury's home signs, which is Gemini. So those are our basic stats for Sagittarius. It's a diurnal, fire, mutable, hot sign ruled by the planet Jupiter. All right. So where should we start here in terms of this? One of the things I've talked about a lot is the sequence of the signs of the zodiac. And it seems like the signs of the zodiac often have a corrective function over the sign that came before it. So one of our starting points or our contrasts might be a little bit of the contrast having done the Scorpio episode last month, and then talking about what it is then that Sagittarius brings that's new or different, or, you know, acts as a corrective or almost like improving function to counterbalance the emphasis of the qualities of the sign that came before. And one of the things that came up in that last episode was this funny joke by astrologer named Micah, and they said that one of the things they like to do just to like bother Scorpios is like at a bar or something is to say that the Scorpio says something to them and they say it's really not that deep, or it's not that deep. So there's like a seriousness and an intensity to Scorpio, and I think one of the primary things that I always notice when you get to Sagittarius is suddenly things lighten up like a lot, and it's a lot more jokey, it's a lot more jovial, a lot more like gregarious, and there's maybe a bigger sense even of optimism in some ways, of this boundless sort of optimism and playfulness, I think, that acts as the contrast coming after Scorpio. What do you two think about that?
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think it's quite a contrast, really, when you move from Scorpio to Sagittarius. It's like a real handbrake turn. I think there's an interesting kind of follow through in a way, because Scorpio has a real great interest in the topic of truth, you know, getting to the bottom of things and really understanding what is the truth, what is the real nature of things. And I think Sagittarius shares that, but it also has a different perspective on it. So Scorpio might have like a more cold, hard look at truth, whereas Sagittarius has a more optimistic take and tends to see like the bright side of things. So there's that interest in understanding things deeply, but Sagittarius sort of has a optimistic spin, or, you know, maybe unkindly we could say like rose-tinted glasses, perhaps.
Jupiter.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the sort of the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about the contrast between those two signs. How about you, Ashley?
So I love all of those points, and kind of as you guys were saying, I feel like Sagittarius is kind of the light that comes after Scorpio, and you have to think of Scorpio as the death and rebirth process, kind of. And Sagittarius is what is blossoming from that rebirth. And I would see Scorpio as more of like black and white, and Sagittarius being more colorful. And definitely...
That's a good point. So it's almost like Sagittarius coming after Scorpio is the notion that there is almost like life after death, or a life after death, potentially. Like even in, you know, those smaller instances in our lives where we go through a phase of things dying or things coming to an end and a close, and there can be like a darkness and sadness to that. Sagittarius is the one that comes after that says like, this is just one phase. And if you look at it in the big picture, it's not the end necessarily.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like Scorpio is almost more comfortable with being in a depressive state. I know depression is kind of Saturn, but I would say they're more comfortable with wallowing a little bit or looking at the darker side of things. And Sagittarius is also comfortable with the dark side, but they're a little bit more detached. Whereas Scorpio's attached to whatever happened to them. And Sagittarius just wants to move on. They don't really think about the past anymore. They're the bow and arrow that's shot upward. So
that's a really good point, because the Scorpio one of the things we talked about was having difficulty letting go and like hanging on to things, whether it's people or emotions or like past conflicts or injuries or something like that somebody did to the person. Versus Sagittarius has an easier time maybe letting go of things and moving forward.
Yeah. And just another thing to touch on that, actually, I feel like in a way, all fire signs are really good at kind of letting go and getting rid of things that no longer serve you, which is something that Sagittarius is great at. Scorpio can kind of hold on to things that don't serve them any longer. And a great example I have of like, think of fire. You use fire to cook your food. You use fire to cook meat to make it edible because it's unsafe to eat that kind of stuff without cooking it. And it kills microorganisms that are not good for you. So again, it's like Sagittarius and fire is letting go of things that are not good for you. Whereas Scorpio may kind of hang on to that. They're fixed. So they're like, well, it's really important to me, whether it's bad or not. And Sag doesn't want any part of that because they want what's best and they're just moving forward.
Right, because Sagittarius is the third fire sign that we've encountered so far in the signs of the zodiac, and it's the one mutable sign. So mutable signs tend to be a lot more flexible, and as opposed to like Leo, that was more of like a fixed fire sign. Sagittarius as a mutable sign has greater ability to like adjust and move around things, perhaps, instead of staying in one place.
Change.
Change, yeah.
That's a really good point. It reminds me of one of my other notes in the contrast between Scorpio and Sag, which is exactly that issue of the modality. On the sort of topic of truth and inquiry and things like that, Scorpio really wants to be certain and to have, certainty about things. Whereas I think Sagittarius is more ready to embrace ambiguity and embrace things that are like not necessarily completely settled. And I think that's the mutable quality coming through that sort of, it's so like looking at the big picture, things are complicated, things are messy. And Sagittarius is like okay to be in that kind of messy space and reconciling different perspectives and different ways of thinking. Whereas I think Scorpio really wants to hone in and really try and, perhaps it's the Mars part as well. A fixed Mars wants to just hit the bullseye. Sagittarius is comfortable to kind of like have more of a spread around the target, if you like.
Yeah, I like that because that goes back to that analogy I've mentioned many times that Robert Zoller always gave me, where he said Aries is like a machine gun fire versus Scorpio is like a sniper rifle. It's just like a single piercing shot that's like right on the target. But then when you get to Sagittarius again, it's just like, a hail of shooting arrows every which direction, and eventually like some of them will hit the target or many targets.
Yeah, I like the idea of like a barrage of arrows or like artillery or something. This is getting a bit martial,
Right.
but maybe that's my Aries rising coming through. But like, you don't have to hit to be effective. As long as enough hit, then you've done the job. So it's a little bit similar in that way. Yeah.
And with Jupiter, like you think Jupiter is expansion, and like we have so many opportunities. We feel there's so many arrows we have. Why would we focus so much on the one arrow when we have so many chances? And I was listening to the Aries episode with Rick Levine, and I think he mentioned that Aries is kind of like a ready, fire, aim instead of ready, aim, fire.
Right.
And I feel like Sagittarius is pretty similar. We do tend to hit the bullseye because we're archers, we're hunters. But we are kind of a ready, fire, aim as well, where we don't really think of the consequences until we've already fired.
That fire sign, like enthusiasm, we're excited to get started. And sometimes we don't do that prep work that Scorpio would do.
Blind optimism too, that Scorpio may see as like naive, like, why aren't you taking more time to think about this? But Sagittarius kind of needs that blind optimism to make certain things happen. If you didn't have this strong belief in, I can do anything, like I really can do anything I set my mind to. Because again, Sagittarius is a perfect blend of like the animal instinct, the animal side, and then humanity. So it's kind of like the blend of that. And if we set our minds to it, we can physically do it.
That's a good point.
At least we think so.
That human and animal contrast in Sagittarius. I think the medieval books would certainly talk about, the first part of Sagittarius being, the human, and the second part of the sign being bestial, or the other way around. I can't remember which way it goes. But they would divide the sign up in that way and say that, the first half is more human and the other half is more animal in nature. And that combination comes through in lots of different ways.
I like that point about optimism and just being the first Jupiter-ruled sign, because most of the other signs, except for the 2 Saturn-ruled signs, we've already encountered one version of so far, with like Venus's 2 signs or Mercury's 2 signs or what have you. So this is the first time in this series that we've encountered Jupiter. And one of the things about Jupiter is just that it affirms and it confirms things, and has a very like positive, Jupiter being the greater benefic, or the larger and more positive of the 2 benefic planets between Venus and Jupiter. There is this underlying sort of like unbridled optimism that sometimes comes with Sagittarius or people with heavy Sagittarius placements. One of the astrologers I always think of, like every time I think of Sagittarius, is an astrologer who unfortunately passed away a number of years ago, but his name was Kelly Lee Phipps, and he just had this stellium in Sagittarius. So he had Sagittarius rising, like the ascendant at 18 degrees of Sagittarius, and then he had Neptune, Jupiter, Mars, and Venus all in Sagittarius in the first whole sign house. And this guy was just a bundle of just like unbridled enthusiasm, and it was so, sometimes like over the top, but it could be so disarming, like that he could just come up and like embrace like anybody with this enthusiasm. And he had that also for projects, and it reminded me of this project that he did where he suddenly just got the idea, he wanted to make like a documentary about astrology, where he interviewed a bunch of astrologers, and he kind of made it like that movie in the mid 2000s, What the Bleep Do We Know? He wanted to do like an astrology version of that. And he didn't have any like experience doing like filmmaking or interviews or video editing or anything else. He's just like, I want to do this and I'm going to do it. So he just like set an intention for doing it, and then he started just like manifesting it, and he raised funds, like a client or somebody wrote him a check for like $20,000 or something, and he bought like all this video equipment, and then he just goes out and starts interviewing astrologers at conferences over the course of the next few years. And if you watch the video, it's like his first interviews weren't very good because he was just learning as he went about doing like audio and video, and like he had some interviews where he was outside and like the wind was blowing, so the audio was all messed up, but it didn't matter, because instead of needing to like plan every little detail and everything out ahead of time, which maybe for some people would have stopped them in their tracks by, losing the momentum and not being able to finish the project because they never took the first step, his enthusiasm and just belief in himself and in what the vision is that he's had in his mind, and his optimism just sort of like carried him through the project eventually in the end. And he was able to like see that to completion as like one of the major things in terms of his life work before he passed away prematurely from cancer at a relatively young age. But I always think of his optimism and enthusiasm as one of his like core traits.
And that does make a good contrast with the more sort of skeptical or cynical or like, careful approach of Scorpio.
Right.
I think a Scorpio wouldn't dive in that way. They would much prefer to, do a lot of preparation and come in when they know that they're ready and they've got that mastery, rather than just, diving in and just with the optimism that this will work out somehow. We'll figure it out on the way.
Yeah. And that's really the contrast with especially the two adjacent malefic rule, quote unquote malefic ruled signs, which are Scorpio right before Sagittarius and then Capricorn right after. Because then with Capricorn, you get another corrective function where suddenly Capricorn is much more cautious. It is much more pessimistic. It is wanting to plan for the long term and what the long term goal is, and to have that sort of in sight. So with both of those, but it's like Sagittarius is just this super optimistic island that's just kind of like sandwiched in between these otherwise a little bit more pessimistic signs in some ways.
That's a really good point. It's sort of like there's an interesting flow through those three signs where Scorpio has that kind of, let's look at the cold hard reality of things. Let's pick up the rock and look at the bugs that are crawling around underneath, And then Jupiter says, well, hold on a minute. If you zoom out and you look at the big picture of things, life's actually amazing and beautiful and wonderful. And look at how the stars turn and look at how like life grows and flourishes. And, isn't it amazing to be here? And then Capricorn comes in and says, yes, but ultimately everything will die and the sun will go out and the universe will be cold and dead. And, so it's sort of like zooming out layer by layer. But ultimately, Saturn as the highest visible planet is like the final word on things. And there's a sort of a somber note that we're left with Capricorn.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So Camille Michelle Gray actually helped with some of the research going into this episode. One of the things that she wrote for Capricorn's corrective function over Sagittarius is that Capricorn corrects Sagittarius with dedication, focus on an end goal, sobered thought, methodological approach, delayed gratification, willingness to go it alone, practicality, and risk aversion, which is a good keyword, I think, for Capricorn as well. I think by contrast, like Sagittarius doesn't have as much like risk aversion necessarily.
That's true. And that's another good contrast with Scorpio is that I think there's an openness to Sagittarius and like almost a trusting quality. We tend to think the best of people. And then we're often surprised and like shocked when people are not as good as we think they are. And Scorpio, I think, might look at Sagittarius's, openness and trusting nature with almost like concern or worry, like that this person's going to get hurt. Because Scorpio has that defensive quality to it, where Sagittarius almost like is taking off its armor and just saying like, here I am, like who could ever hate me?
Yeah. And I feel like too, so you guys were kind of mentioning like the Capricorn stuff a little bit. And I think a word that is shared with Sagittarius and Capricorn is broad-mindedness. And I do think that they're very different types of broad-mindedness. Of course, we've talked about Sagittarius is more positive, whereas Capricorn is going to be a little bit more realistic and really look at the consequences. They're going to think before they act, think before they do anything. And they're a little more disciplined in themselves, kind of like Scorpio. And Sagittarius would rather procrastinate and just act on impulse, I think.
There's a more measured approach with Capricorn. Like, let's take the steps up the mountain, one after the other, steadily towards the goal. Yeah. Whereas Sagittarius is more sort of flippy floppy and like when inspiration strikes, we'll make great strides. But yes, there is a procrastinating side as well. I really like what you said about the broad perspective of both of those signs. I think because they're ruled by the planets that are the highest up in the traditional cosmos and the highest visible planets, both Jupiter and Saturn sit above and look down on things from that very high perspective, but they have a different take on things. They have a different, their conclusion from that perspective is different.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I liked what you said, Rob, about making great strides and speed, because I think that was something that really came up, and I've really gotten a better sense of this year for Aries, one of the, like the need for speed is like a very Aries type thing, or a core function of Aries. And the other sign that's like that, actually, that's very quick and likes doing things fast and taking great like leaps or strides is definitely Sagittarius.
Mhm.
It does rule the thighs, doesn't it, in the zodiac?
Yes.
The body, the assignment of different zodiac signs to the human body. It rules the thighs, the powerful muscles that drive the legs. Yeah.
Yep. Gets
Right.
us moving, allows us to take that action. Moving forward. We couldn't move forward if we couldn't move our legs.
Yeah. That what you said earlier, Ashley, about always moving forward and always thinking what's next and trying not to look back too much. So it's interesting how these ideas kind of combine.
Definitely.
That's a good point. That's a good core thing, like looking forward as opposed to looking back.
The arrow only goes one way.
Right. Yeah. Versus other signs like Scorpio and Capricorn that are more backwards looking or sometimes focused on the past, maybe not exclusively, but certainly more so.
Or even so, like I feel like they are a little more present even. Could be past or present, whereas Sagittarius is looking into the future with their arrow. They're looking forward, future.
I like that.
Possibilities, anything is possible in the future, right? And that is the epitome of Sagittarius, is anything is possible.
Right. All right. So I'm trying to think if we have any good chart examples that are related to any of that we put there, of like forward thinking people. The only one that comes to immediate mind is just Einstein, as somebody I'd been looking at their biography. And I know, Ashley, you mentioned him because he has Cancer rising and he had the moon in Sagittarius in the 6th whole sign house. And while people often focus on him as a Pisces, he has a sun in Pisces in the 9th whole sign house with the midheaven, which is true and is a major part of his being able to think outside of the box. I think there was also a major element there with Sagittarius as well, in terms of the forward thinkingness and sort of being ahead of his time in some ways.
And he obviously carries strong Jupiter energy with like having his sun and moon in signs that are ruled by Jupiter. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I was wondering whether Walt Disney might be a good example of like someone who's looking to the future and innovating as well, with his career in animation being very looking ahead and trying to push the boundaries of what you can do with that art, that form of art. Like, for example, with the first animated film with sound, and then the first feature length animated film. And he was always thinking, what else can I do with this medium? Or Fantasia. These are all sort of very like big ideas, big projects.
Creative.
Yeah. So he's pushing the field forward.
And for the audio listeners, it looks like we may have a time chart. So if this is correct, he had Virgo rising and he had the sun conjunct Uranus in Sagittarius in the 4th whole sign house, or the 3rd quadrant house, because the IC is there at 24 degrees. So go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that to me speaks as like him bringing all of those qualities that Rob just talked about, bringing it like home and personal and like making it almost relatable in a way. And Disney speaks to everybody. I feel like, everyone's seen a Disney movie or, that's been a part of their life somehow.
Yes. Yeah. And one ways that's interesting is like a lot of what Disney did was because the 4th house is like our family, but also like ancestry and the past and the things that you inherit from the past and from your family. And what he took is he took a lot of old fairy tales and a lot of old like cultural stories and stuff that had been passed down for a very long time, and then sort of reinterpreted those in a modern context through those animated films.
That's a really good point.
And you can look at these stories in a way as like a sort of mythology too, I guess. And I would relate that to Sagittarius. It's like symbolism and, storytelling. I feel like storytelling is also a good Sagittarius word. It's like wanting to share ideas and share these things. And like you said, with the fourth house being kind of the past, it's bringing history forward and making it a creative way to share it with people. And it's like fun and innocent. And it's Disney, it's a cartoon, but these are like real past stories that are maybe a little difficult to really look at, but he makes it palatable and shareable. He's a great storyteller and I would say pioneer in that industry.
Yeah. And the other big picture thing is also building those huge things like Disney World and Disneyland. And, and some of those were also very like forward thinking, but also, huge in terms of scale and like thinking big picture and long term rather than something like small or more isolated.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Disney World, Disneyland. I think people would criticize him for being so optimistic and having these big ideas that they thought it wouldn't work out. People called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs Disney's folly when it first came out because they thought it was just a massive waste of money and energy and that it wouldn't be successful. But he believed in his dreams. He believed that this would work. There's a funny story about him apparently being very bad at business and not really being very successful initially until he brought his brother in, and the brother took care of the business side of things while Walt focused on his creativity. And I think that's a thing that often comes up with Sagittarius is like a disregard for what's going on around you, sort of everyday mundane things, while you're focusing on your big dreams and your big plans. And sometimes Sagittarius needs someone around them, like perhaps someone with some Virgo or Capricorn placements to help them to actually achieve what they want to achieve, because they're all about the ideas, but then actually making it into a reality is sometimes a bit more hard.
Yeah, and I feel like that's where the corrective function of Capricorn comes back into, is like allowing that structure and the things that need to be taken care of, so that the Sag can have fun and be optimistic and pursue these crazy wild dreams. And then Capricorn can take care of the responsibilities.
We need that, like the admin support or like the accountant or something,
yes. Like, Dad, you can do this, right?
This just reminded me of this anecdote that Disneyland had actually like a disastrous opening and like first day. And I just did a really quick search and came up with this article where it says 10 things that went disastrously wrong on Disneyland's opening day. And it had this funny line at the beginning where it says Disneyland is commonly known as the happiest place on earth. I think that's really funny for like a Sagittarius, like Walt Disney's like Sun and Uranus in the fourth house and just like creating a place known as the happiest place on earth. But it says, but when that park opened in 1955, it didn't live up to its now ubiquitous nickname. In fact, Disney employees who survived the day referred to it as Black Sunday. So it's just funny in terms of that whole, like, having a big picture and going for it and launching it. But then sometimes they can stumble early on because it's not always like perfectly like planned or like thought out ahead of time.
I actually had a great little anecdote I wanted to tell, or like a story I wanted to tell on this, that talks about this issue of Sagittarius like focusing on the big picture and missing the details and what's in front of them, which is an old story that comes up in Aesop's fables, but it's also present in, I think the earliest telling of it is in a dialogue of Plato. I think it's called a Theaetetus. I'm probably massacring that Greek word. In the dialogue, they're talking about the difference between philosophers and ordinary people. And Plato uses as an example the story of the philosopher Thales, who was one of the earliest Greek philosophers on record. There's a story of him walking through the field at night and gazing up at the stars and like wondering at the stars and wondering how they work and like just, inspired and full of awe at the mystery of the heavens. And then he trips and falls into a well. And there's a field hand nearby, a female. She comes up and she helps this guy out of the well, and she scolds him, and she says, oh, Tailies, you're always looking up at the heavens and wondering at what's going on in the heavens, but you don't even know what's happening at your feet. And I think that is just a great like Sagittarius anecdote. I think that fits really well with the Sagittarius archetype, where our minds are off contemplating big ideas and the beauty and wonder of things, but we often miss what's happening around us and things that are actually really important for our safety and well-being sometimes as well.
Mm-hmm. And
Totally.
I feel like that reminds me of that there is like this deep within good and bad, like within Sagittarius. Like there's this positive, great side to Sagittarius, but there is a balance needed because there is a dark side to Sagittarius. I think, they're coming from the Scorpio. And like you said, I mean, falling into the well, like if you're only focused on these good things and not paying attention to the bad, then, you're going to be disappointed when things don't go your way. And I do think of like Jupiter is kind of getting your head lost in the clouds a little bit. And you do, like it's important for Sagittarius to stay grounded and reminded of reality and not just always looking to the heavens, looking, what does this mean? It's like, well, maybe the answer is right here.
Right. That's funny, that story, Rob, because there's like a later adaptation of that in something called the Alexander Romance, which is like this series of stories that were like fanciful stories in the Roman Empire about Alexander the Great. And one of them, it was like the same setup, except it was like a young child, Alexander the Great, who was being taught by an astrologer. And the astrologer was off like watching the stars one day and just looking at the sky and walking and talking and waxing very philosophical and things. But then he like fell into a hole and like hurt himself. And Alexander like says something like negative about like maybe you should pay more attention to where you're walking, astrologer, or something like that. So there's like a funny astrology version of that story as well.
Yeah, I've heard that it came up in like attacks on astrologers in the 17th century. Like it became a popular like way to mock astrologers for like being like aloof and like disconnected from reality. So yeah, it is sort of, it's got a funny pertinence to the name of our podcast, I suppose. Yeah.
Well,
for sure.
I was just going to say what's something you said, Ashley, about the dark side of Sag. It's worth talking about that because in my personal life, I know a great many Sagittariuses. They seem to gather around me, but a lot of them have actually been through great periods of like sadness and depression in their lives. It's something I've noticed. I think part of that can be that the optimism and that sort of childlike wonder and sort of that openness and trusting quality of Sagittarius can be really badly hurt. And, if they experience like a major setback, or if they experience cruelty towards them or hatred towards them, or if they're like bullied or victimized or those kinds of experiences, it can be really difficult for a Sagittarius to actually recover from that because they lose their optimism in that moment and they lose their joy, that sort of, joie de vivre. And sometimes digging yourselves out of that hole, is really difficult. So there's a vulnerability to Sagittarius because they are so focused on the positive that if that's robbed from them, then it's very difficult for them to recover from it.
Yeah, that's really important. And I've noticed that as well, just something Sagittariuses can struggle with versus, let's say, Capricorns or people with heavy Saturn placements, is they can feel like their fire's being like squelched if the Saturn influenced person is more pessimistic or something. It can feel stifling because the Sagittarius almost like needs to have that hope and optimism in order to drive them forward. And when that's when somebody's like throwing water on that fire a little bit too much, it can feel like their flame is starting to suffer or starting to struggle as a result.
Yeah, and that makes me think of not necessarily like making this like a negative side to Sag, but it could be detrimental, I guess. I mean, going back to the bow and arrow, optimism, always moving forward. We love to have goals. We do like to achieve. We like to always have something to be aiming toward. We always, we're hunting something. We always want to be hunting for something. And once we achieve what we've been hunting or what we've been shooting for, then we lose a little bit of ourselves because we don't have a goal anymore. We don't have that thing to chase anymore. So I've noticed that with myself. I have so many like things that I'm interested in, because if I achieve one of them, then I'm just stagnant at that point. And I feel like we always need something new to set our minds to. And that might be worth balancing, is not being too overly optimistic that you're forgetting about all these other things in your life and other goals.
Yeah, that's a good point. The other thing that can be tricky sometimes with that type of optimism is that sometimes you get into almost like magical thinking, which sometimes works out for those people, that the optimism actually carries it through, and it has this weird reinforcing like loop effect of like, because the person is so optimistic and thinks they can accomplish things, they try to accomplish more and are sometimes more successful as a result of that, or have luck. They just happen to be like lucky as a trait to some extent, and more successful in accomplishing some things than other people. And sometimes they can get into the mindset of like that everything's being manifested through their optimism, like with like The Secret or something like that. And then sometimes the shadow side of that can be not understanding that not everybody else is that lucky, or that there are people that like fall into hard times and it's not necessarily their fault. So that sometimes that can become like almost like victim blaming in a way, by assuming that if everybody was just as like optimistic or thought and tried to manifest things, that it would work out the same for everybody, and not really getting it when that's not equally true for every person.
Yeah, definitely. And that also reminds me too that like it is difficult for Sagittarians, I think, sometimes to see other people's views because they're so set in their way of thinking and the tools that they're equipped with, that, I feel like we can kind of have that God complex or superiority complex where it's like, well, I'm right and what you're doing is wrong. And I don't know why you're not just doing it the way that I'm doing it, because works out for me and I'm lucky. And I just feel like that's something that we really need to keep in mind and not judge and criticize other people, because our side of the truth is valid, but there are many sides of truth, not just the Sag side. And I think that's kind of where Gemini actually does this a bit better, I guess. They are the twins. So they're naturally inclined to seeing two sides or seeing another side, or having that duality where they're like, okay, there is another opinion here. Whereas Sagittarius is being the opposite is a little different. And they're like, well, my truth is right. And I, struggle seeing other people's sides sometimes.
There is a judgmental quality to Sagittarius, I think. Like, I'm reminded of the way that in the medieval astrology, they would assign Jupiter to the figure of the judge, or like the person who has that position of authority. And so Sagittarius often has that feeling of that I am the arbiter of the truth. I am the judge, and I have the authority to like say what's right and wrong. So there's almost like in a good way, it can create kind of like a noble spirit in someone, but on the downside, it can create like kind of an arrogant way of thinking about things, where you just think that you've got it all figured out. I've thought about this and I know that it's right because I feel it deeply, and this is something that inspires me and fills me with this feeling of like truth. So your perspective can't be right because that will take away that feeling from me. And I think, it's another sort of shadow side, I suppose, of Sagittarius, is this need to be right and this need to appear authoritative. And I think one of the things that Sagittarius fears a lot is being shown to be wrong, or being made to look foolish or silly. Even though we're very good at making ourselves look that way.
But only if we make ourselves look silly. No one else.
if we're allowed to mock ourselves, but no one else is allowed to mock us. There's a sort of I don't know how to put it, like an aloof quality, and like a kind of like a proud or like dignified, like sort of feeling to Sagittarius. They have like a bit of dignity, like pride in themselves. And one way to really make a Sagittarius angry and bring out that fire is to mock them or insult them or like just publicly humiliate them. That is something that Sagittarius just absolutely cannot stand. And that's when you'll see like some of the anger and like that sort of that divine fury, if you like, the Sagittarius trait comes through.
One of the phrase that I'm thinking of now that I think, as both of you are saying this, that I think it would be a perfect phrase for Sagittarius is the passion of a convert. Have you ever heard of this? I looked up the definition on Wiktionary, and it says the extreme enthusiasm shown by a person who has recently taken to a new task or a new set of beliefs. So it gives an example. Jim showed the passion of a convert when he became a vegan. Or it's like an observation that sometimes people that grow up in like a certain religious setting, let's say with a certain religion, are kind of used to it, and they understand the pros and cons and everything, and have sometimes like a moderate approach to things. But sometimes when somebody converts to a new religion, or they find a new belief system or a new approach or even a new just way of doing things, they're so enthusiastic about it that they want to spread it around and tell everybody about it and sort of become an evangelist for that thing. And I think sometimes that can be a Sagittarius trait. It's one of the ones that Camille wrote down here: the evangelist, the missionary, the know-it-all, truthiness, and sometimes even going over into being dogmatic or even rigid in some instances.
Yeah, just in my personal life, I have been that person several times. I can think of at least two examples. One was when I was around. They're both kind of related. When I got into astrology, and I was particularly interested in traditional astrology, and I became something of like a traditional astrology chauvinist, I guess. Like I was like, oh, you do modern astrology. That's okay for you, but I'm interested in like the real astrology, quote unquote. And I was like really like awful about that for a few years. And it was interesting that coincided as well with my resurging interest in religion. I must have had some big ninth house activation or something at this time. But I got into astrology as well as sort of rediscovering my faith. And started going back to church and things like this. And I had that, I wasn't like as insufferable about my religion as I was about astrology, actually, but I did have that kind of passion of the convert when it came to, like re-embracing my Christian, tradition. And it was taking things probably a bit too far in terms of like in Lent, I just went like crazy with like self-denial and things like that. Like I just took it to an extreme in a way that was like really noticeable to people around me. They were like, whoa, like where is this coming from? I've mellowed out a lot since then, but it's funny to sort of reflect that I have been that person. And it's a tendency that I have to sort of like moderate.
Yeah.
I can relate.
Have you had a specific instance of that, Ashley, or like a phase of something like that?
I mean, your example also, the traditional versus modern, like, oh, the way that I study this is right. And really, again, that's where it goes back into there's more than one side to the truth. There's a lot of different languages in the world, which language, Sagittarius, and you could be saying the same thing, but it's in a different language. And it doesn't mean that it's wrong. You're still conveying the same kind of ideas. So yeah, I've definitely had that struggle. I don't know if this is related, but I have this in my notes. My dad is a Sagittarius also. And I remember when I was a kid, he would just so seriously tell me all the time that he knows everything. That he literally knows everything in the world. And I could ask him anything and he could tell it to me. Like, I know everything, Ashley. And I'm just like, how are you a book? How do you know everything? And as I grow older, I'm like, you don't know everything, but just having that, like, I'm right and I know everything and I'm the master. You can come to me if you need to learn anything. And I think too, being mutable, it does kind of work in our favor that like we give that, oh, we know everything. And you can come to us with something and we'll figure out that answer for you. We're broadened enough that we're willing to research and learn it. but we're going to lie ahead of time and say we already know it.
Yeah. I have a Sagittarius father as well, Ashley, and my condolences. That story triggered some memories in me about my own father who he did have definitely, and he's still alive. He has that know-it-all quality to him. I mean, in some level it's justified because he spends a lot of time reading very widely about all sorts of different topics. He's very intellectual. And I think that's another trait in Sagittarius is like, we love to learn. It's the eternal student archetype. A few different signs have this quality at Sagittarius as well. This like passion for learning, often like always learning and preferring to be in that learning space, preferring to be in that kind of academic, detached place of books and documentary films and absorbing knowledge. Like I read Wikipedia for fun. Like that's the kind of person that I am, and my dad's kind of similar in that way. And then it's like humbling when you actually don't know the answer to something and you don't actually have like all the answers. You don't actually have all the knowledge. A lot of Sagittariuses I know are like very intelligent people and like absorb a huge amount of information, but actually conveying that to other people can be challenging. And it doesn't necessarily always help them with their lives as well. Like they're very smart, but that doesn't necessarily translate into like material success in this lifetime.
Or knowing a lot about a bunch of different things, sort of like traveling or wandering around, collecting little bits of knowledge everywhere, but that not always necessarily being like practical knowledge that's like immediately useful per se.
Yeah, it's like that intellectual magpie that just collects lots of shiny things and puts it in the nest. And it's almost like sometimes it's like a, what do you call it? Like a dissociation trait. Like you're doing this because it's more, it's easier than dealing with real life. It's more fun to be in the library than to actually sit with your problems and the mistakes you've made and like sit and actually kind of like reflect on, what's actually happened to you. You can just retreat to the study or, put on a documentary and be transported away from things.
Yeah. Or go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that kind of goes back to the whole centaur thing too, being half humanity, half animal. We can almost, easily get our heads in the clouds or out of reality and just learning and bookworms or documentary worms. And but I feel like we are able to be grounded if we're aware of it because we do have that animal side to us. Where we can come back to reality and then we can switch back and forth between, learning and doing physical things. And another thing I just wanted to touch on too, we love learning. We love always reading books and knowing everything, which Gemini also does. You said a lot of other signs are like this too, but I think the difference with Sagittarius and what gives us kind of like that superiority feeling is we like to be the teacher. We're not just like learning for our own selves, but it's to be the conveyor of these ideas. Like we want to preach these things to people. We want to like implement these rather than just like, oh, it's just for fun. And like it is kind of just for fun, but it's also to help others and be able to say that we know these things. And when we don't actually know something, it can be exciting. Like it is something new. And I feel like that's the fuel that we're always looking for. Like gasoline keeps the fire roaring. And if you run out of gasoline, how are you going to keep going? So it's kind of like that every once in a while you find something that you don't know. That's the fuel. That's more gasoline. And I feel like that is beneficial to us to not know it all.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Always needing or wanting new horizons to explore or something like that. That also gives me the image of like the scholar or the academic that knows like 10 different languages, but doesn't know how to change like a tire on a car or something like that. Like it's like philosophical or academic or religious or other like big picture learning of big picture things in the universe, like Einstein coming up with like the theory of relativity or what have you, but it not being necessarily always just like, small term, like practical type knowledge, like how to change a tire or something like that.
Like, can you actually apply this to your life, or is it just an idea?
Right.
Yeah. But the absent-minded professor is definitely like a Sagittarius archetype for sure. Yeah,
totally. And that actually just reminded me of David Pingree, who's a famous classic scholar and scholar on the history of science and history of astrology. And I don't have a birth time for him, but I do know that he had Venus and Mercury in the sign of Sagittarius, as well as Jupiter and Mars and Neptune in the south node in the sign of Virgo. And he was just like this, he was a polyglot, which means that he just had this ability with languages, and he knew like 20 different languages. And like he knew every modern European language. He could read like French and Spanish and German and everything else. But then he also knew all of these ancient languages, like ancient Greek and Arabic and Akkadian and Latin and Middle Persian and everything else. So he also knew Sanskrit. So in his PhD dissertation, he did this book called the Yavanajataka, which was like an early Sanskrit text on astrology, where he argued in his dissertation that this text was originally a Greek astrological text that had been translated into Sanskrit. And so for his PhD dissertation, he like made a critical edition of reconstructing the original text of the Yavanajataka in Sanskrit. He translated that in English, but then also he wrote a second volume that was like commentary on that, where he went through and he quoted every ancient Western author as well as Indian author that he could in their original language, in order to demonstrate how the doctrines in these texts were similar or were connected. But if you pick up the second volume and read his commentary, he'll be writing in English, and then he'll quote a medieval astrologer in Arabic, and he'll write it out in Arabic. So it's like you have to know Arabic to read that passage, and then he'll quote another author in Latin, or he'll quote another author in Sanskrit, or he just keeps going through different languages because he knows like all of these languages due to that big picture sort of thing.
It's an amazing, like what an impressive man. But then, one wonders, like, could he change a tire on his car and things like. But that's it. I mean, it's a amazing talent, and a lot of Sagittarius, if you sit down and talk with them, they will divulge that they have this vast learning on something that they're passionate about. But then, there is that maybe you wonder, like, is there a practical application to this? Like, apart from being fascinating in an academic context, like, the layperson is not going to be interested in these esoteric things, even though they're like absolutely fascinating to people in that field and like a great gift to people in that field.
It makes me think of the Library of Alexandria originally, how it was actually supposed to be sort of like a scholarly institute that was funded by the state, and there would be these scholars that would go and live there and just like work in the library and do this amazing scholarship. But then they would have their basic necessities like kind of paid for, where, they would go and be able to eat food, for free, and then just like go back to work on their scholarly stuff, so that they didn't have to deal with the basic like necessities of life and could focus on these scholarly pursuits most of the time.
That reminds me too of like certain religions and monks, for example. They totally leave civilization and reality in a way to focus on these higher things and to work within, rather than worrying about like food and how am I going to change this tire. They don't even have to worry about that. So I think that definitely ties in with Sag as well. But it is important to have a balance.
Yeah, for sure. And things can become unbalanced. It reminded me, like, we've talked about religion and like the passion of the convert, but that also comes up for like politics. And sometimes you'll see people that have heavy Sagittarius placements get into a new political thing and then become very like adamant or very much of an advocate about that, sometimes to an extreme, or sometimes like going over the top.
Yes. It doesn't matter. It's not necessarily always like philosophical things or spiritual things. It can also be politics, or sometimes people get really interested in science. It's another Sagittarius quality, but it's always something that's kind of high-minded, I guess. Maybe that's the right word. Like, it's a lofty kind of topic. So politics is, while it does have a very practical and real effect on our lives, there's also kind of like a theoretical, like idealistic sort of side to politics. We're talking about like big ideas, like what's the right way to live, or what's the right way to govern. You know, these are sort of big picture things.
I've only started to understand in the past few years how intertwined like belief and religion and politics are, because we always think about our politics so much as like these well thought out like logical things of I have this political belief because of X deduction or whatever. This is like practically speaking why I think this is right or what have you. But oftentimes we don't realize that our beliefs are a little bit less rational sometimes, and the reason why we go in certain directions is a little bit more belief based than we might think in terms of our politics, and is a bit more similar in that way to sometimes like religious things than we might think.
Yeah. And bringing up politics, because we've talked a lot about like religion and, you know, being the priest or the priestess, that kind of thing. But I feel like Sagittarius is especially drawn to topics that are touchy subjects to the majority of people: politics, religion, science, all of that stuff. And I think that's a fire quality. We like causing disruption a little bit. We don't want it to be so comfortable, except for ourselves, because we're right. We want to be comfortable. But yeah, that's something I've noticed. We just love controversial issues.
Yeah, topics that like upset people at a dinner party is like Sagittarius' favorite
we'll
thing.
Bring it up.
Yeah, like, let's talk about this really tough thing that happened in history that's like awful, and everyone around you is like, oh my God, we're just trying to have a nice conversation.
Yeah, here she goes talking about the occult again. And it's like, yeah, let me tell you. And I brought my Satanic Bible today, or, you know, like just very weird things.
Yeah.
Here's well, there's a point there that's actually that's funny. The edgy sort of thing of, the Sagittarius could be the person that's edgy. Like I remember I did an episode earlier this year with a couple of astrology skeptics, and I think the title was like how to talk about astrology to non-astrologers or to skeptics of astrology. And one of the guys did mention like that he was in the Church of Satan, but what he meant by that was he believed in like science, and he was an atheist and other things like that. And he didn't actually believe in the Christian idea of Satan, but it was just kind of a thing that he said to be edgy, to troll sort of Christians in a way.
And I definitely relate to that. Sometimes like you just want to be the badass, or you want to like just make people uncomfortable.
That's so funny, because that's so similar to Aries, where Aries wants to be a badass, but like driving fast and like, you know, breaking the speed limit rules. But Sagittarius wants to be edgy by like breaking the like moral, you know, philosophical rules or something like that.
Structures. And we're right next to Capricorn. So it's like, I mean, they deal with structures and we like kind of disrupting them. And yeah,
I like that. Well, one of the politics people that comes to mind that Camille mentioned was Jon Stewart, who was the host of The Daily Show on Comedy Central for many years, and was sort of fell into this role where he was just a comedian, but he was a comedian that had some interest in politics. And then he ended up being the second host of The Daily Show, and ended up somehow in the US becoming this like political figure, basically, because he would do commentary and what's the word when you're like kind of like making fun of something, satire of politicians, which like during, for example, like the Bush administration, he would sometimes just point out the hypocrisy in like a funny context of some of the stuff that they would say. And so that's a really good example, because it's somebody blending both politics as well as humor and comedy. And we don't have a birth time for him, unfortunately. There wasn't somebody asked him. Patrick Watson and I actually wrote a blog called the Political Astrology Blog years ago, and there was this clip once at the beginning of The Daily Show where somebody in the audience asked him his birth time, and he was just like, I have no idea. And he kind of blew off the comment, but that was our That was our last shot at it. Hopefully somebody else will find it out someday. But
I appreciate whoever tried.
Yeah, kudos to whoever like gave it a shot. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So for the audio listeners, Jon Stewart has the sun, Mercury, and possibly the moon in Sagittarius. The moon here in this noon chart is at 22. So it's a pretty good chance that he was born just after a new moon in Sagittarius, basically.
Wow, that's a lot of Sag. Yeah, and you can see that in his personality and that sort of combination of like humor, but also like he definitely had his beliefs about politics. Like he was pretty firm, like about where he landed, and a lot of this work on that show was using humor to convey and sort of spread, if you like, his perspective on the politics of the day. Yeah, and it was a hugely influential show. I mean, I watched it and I was in Australia. That shows you the reach of the show. Like it's all about American politics, but just because of the humor and also just the fact that America has that sort of hegemony that what happens over there affects us too over here. So we follow politics in America as well. So I enjoyed watching the show when he was hosting for many years, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting. He's come back recently and he's like doing a show again for like Apple or something like that, which is kind of interesting because I noticed he has Saturn in Aquarius. So that means he's been completing his second Saturn return over the course of the past 3 years since 2020, as he's come back to sort of hosting shows like that again after quitting the Daily Show back in like 2015, 2016 or something like that. Which reminds me of actually Conan O'Brien, who I'd noted recently has done the same thing where he's completed his Saturn return over the past few years and he stopped hosting like a comedy show on television every night. And now he's switched to doing like a podcast and has become super successful in that after a 30-year cycle where during his first Saturn return, that was when he first became the host of a late show.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and I do just want to kind of touch on the comedy thing again, because I feel like that is a very powerful tool that we use to like convey our touchy ideas and beliefs. Because you look at almost any comedy that's out there, some of it that's on TV today, I'm like, how is this on TV? How is this okay to be said right now? But because it's a comedy skit, it's acceptable. And Sag uses that as a tool to remain that like, friendly. We like to get along with people. We do like being with in a community and very social. So we don't want to be like, disrupting too much, but we do feel the need to get our opinions out there. And I feel like a lot of comedians do so by using comedy. It's less harsh.
That's a good point, that it's become like a means for conveying certain things, or sometimes people use it for more political or like activist takes on things through comedy. But yeah, there's a real value just in and of itself of comedy in and of itself. And one of the interesting things recently over the past few years is so many of the comedians seem to almost all agree on this fundamental thing, the stand-up comedians, where they want to have the freedom to talk about anything or to attempt to make jokes about anything. And some of them are getting kind of like pushing back or getting kind of nervous about some of the constraints about saying, no, you can't say that, or that topic is off limits, or what have you. Whether rightly or wrongly, I'm not really making a value judgment myself. It's just something I've been observing over the past several years because I watch a lot of different comedy podcasts, and it's interesting seeing that many of them or a large majority seem to share this view that they should have the freedom to just try anything and do anything and go anywhere, and that comedy itself is like that's one of its core requirements almost. And they all start getting very almost sort of like militant or pushing back when that starts getting curtailed or like limited in some ways.
And that's like, comes back to the nomadic traveler that we associate with too. It's like, we don't want restriction, whether it be like physical or mental or opinion based. Like, we don't want restrictions in any sense. So comedy is one of those things that like we feel we can free roam and it's acceptable.
Yeah. Sagittarius loves freedom. And it's interesting that both the Jupiter ruled signs are mutable signs. And so there's that that openness and that flexibility is sort of built in. Jupiter likes to be in a space where it's free to do what it wants. It doesn't like to be locked in. It doesn't like to be restricted. And because Jupiter, one of the significations is comedy, you can see that coming through. Like a comedy that is restrained is to your point, Chris, like I'm not making a value judgment here, but there is something like about the comedy has to have like a I don't know, like the reins taken off or something like that to be authentic or honest in some ways. That being said, like you can use comedy, like we said, for political ends. You can to project your point of view, and that can go either way. Like in terms of like spreading a point of view that's like affirming and like uplifting and like helpful or like positive. You can also use it to spread, something that contrasts with that, like something that is like damning or mocking or deriding someone. So it can go either way. It's not necessarily like always a good thing. But just to thinking about that, how freedom and comedy kind of are intertwined in a way. There's a relationship there.
Definitely.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and it really does go back to both the optimism of Jupiter and the joviality and that jokes and laughter and other things like that are so important, but also freedom as a core component. So I think definitely Sagittarius as like the stand-up comedian in some ways is a really good fit, I think. Yeah. All right. Where else did I want to go with that? I did want to mention really quickly before we move on from that area that you'd mentioned like the scientist and the sometimes how that can become dogmatic. And one of the funny examples of that Camille put in the outline for celebrity charts was Bill Nye, who we don't have a birth time for again, but he has probably Mercury in Sagittarius. It's at 0 degrees, 49 minutes of Sagittarius, the Sun, the North Node, and Venus all in Sagittarius. And he's, a lot of people grew up watching him because he did like a children's program called Bill Nye the Science Guy, where he was like teaching kids science and getting them interested in science and things like that, which was really good and really cool. He also, though more recently, is also kind of like skeptical about like non-scientific subjects. So astrology has been like a frequent sort of source of criticism or thing that he's focused on rejecting in kind of more adamant or sort of like dogmatic terms in some instances.
Yeah, Sagittarius is either like very inspired. Often the case is that they're either really into religion and spirituality and esoteric topics, or they're sort of really dogmatically against them. They take a firm or strong stance one way or the other. I seem to find, I don't find too many Sagittariuses that are like have no strong feelings about these topics. They usually have a position, and they're going to have something to say about it. But it's to your point. I think there is a component of belief, and I want to be careful here because like there are some aspects of science that are, grounded in just like experimentation, and it's sort of hard to dispute. When things like electricity are things that are just real and they're out there in the world, and you can't it's not a matter of belief whether they exist or not. Right. However, there is a component to science, or it's sort of adjacent to science, which is like sort of the philosophy of science, or the how we interpret what science means for us. And there we can get into territory where it can be a dogmatism. Like there's this term scientism, which is this belief that science is the only useful means for ascertaining truth, and that all other approaches to contemplating the world and sort of deriving meaning from it are not helpful. Science is the only path in this kind of philosophy. And some people think that that's just a fact. Whereas like, there are other ways of ascertaining and getting meaning from the world. Like, for example, like, poetry or art or spirituality and things like that. Like there's a way that becoming too interested in science, or not maybe too interested is the wrong term, but like turning science from an objective study of fact into like a belief system, there you can get into that territory where it's a matter of faith.
Mhm.
And I think that's where sometimes that Sagittarius inspiration can, you can have like a very inspired atheist, for example, a very like passionate atheist or a very passionate skeptic. That's in some ways you could argue like a belief system.
Mhm.
Yeah, for sure. And because it just has to do with like making meaning out of the world and everybody trying to understand the big picture issue and understand like what is real and what's actually happening in our lives that gives meaning to it. And I think sometimes people that go that route of like scientism as a belief system sometimes forget that like scientific conclusions are provisional, and it's like to the best of our knowledge this is how the world works currently, but sometimes forget that that's not like the end of the story, or that we're not going to find out other things that might revise that at some point in the future, because it's sometimes tempting to like once to feel like you've found the truth about something. And that goes back to the politics thing, that goes back to religion, that goes back to science, is the search for the truth and the search for meaning. And sometimes once you feel like you found the truth, it's almost like a religious experience, like whatever that truth is, where you've seen everything, you've seen the big picture, you've seen how the universe works, and suddenly like what you're doing here and what the meaning is and everything else, and you want to share that with other people, and you want to impart that onto other people so that they can have that same positive experience that you've felt.
Mhm.
I think is often where that comes from.
Mm.
All right. And then just in passing, that was making me pull up some other charts of others that I happen to notice that have Sagittarius placements. So Neil deGrasse Tyson, for example, who's, famous science advocate and also can sometimes be a little dogmatic about things, has Saturn in Sagittarius. And then his predecessor, really interestingly, actually, Carl Sagan, had the moon at 21 degrees of Sagittarius in a night chart. He was born just after sunset. So it's actually interesting in terms of the degrees, because Neil deGrasse Tyson has his Saturn at 20 degrees of Sagittarius, and he famously did like a second version of the Cosmos TV series just in the past decade, which was supposed to be like a follow-up or almost like a sequel to the series that Carl Sagan did that was so famous on science education in like the 1980s.
He's like almost trying to reground those ideals maybe a little bit with being Saturn, or
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
Have an authoritative take and like
Mhm.
sort of,
Yeah.
really make it concrete.
Mhm.
Shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the ephemeris.co birth chart necklace. So this is an astrological pendant or necklace that you can wear around your neck that shows a custom depiction of your actual birth chart with your ascendant and all of the planetary placements in it. So all you have to do is go to their website, which is ephemeris.co, and enter in your birth information, and it will print a custom-made necklace with your birth chart on it. So you can customize it by choosing the zodiac or the house system that you prefer, and you can even put a custom engraving on the back of the necklace. So all pieces are unique and are handmade in the United States, and it has this nice modern look that is gender neutral and looks good with any outfit. So they've sold over 17,000 orders, so it's quickly becoming a pretty popular little piece in the astrological community, and you can get a 10% discount with the promo code Astrology Podcast. So find out more information about it at ephemeris.co. So I want to transition into the second part of this episode where we start really doing more to contrast Sagittarius with some of the other signs of the zodiac. And we've done a little bit of that already with, Scorpio and Capricorn, but I want to extend that to some of the other signs. I know, Ashley, that you've started to get into some of the contrast with Gemini and with Mercury, which is the sign that's opposite to Sagittarius. And I think that might be a good starting point. So Sagittarius, as we said, is ruled by Jupiter. It's mutable, fire, and masculine or diurnal. And that's opposite to Gemini, which is ruled by Mercury. is an air sign, which is in the Stoic elements is cold rather than hot, and that's why it's opposite to Sagittarius. It's also a mutable sign, and it's also masculine or diurnal. So one of the big contrasts between these two planets is that between these two signs is we have Mercury in Gemini, which is like the smallest planet, versus Jupiter ruling Sagittarius, which is the largest planet. And you get this real contrast of small things versus big things, or like small picture things like conversation or talking versus big picture things in Sagittarius, like as we've been talking about, like belief, truth, religion, politics, and other things like that. So Camille did a list of comparisons between these two that might be a good thing to look at and contrast as a starting point. So here's the contrast. She says Gemini is that which is familiar versus Sagittarius, which is that which is foreign. Gemini is facts, while Sagittarius is faith. Gemini is thoughts versus Sagittarius is beliefs. Gemini is small talk versus Sag, which is big talk. Gemini is knowledge from books versus Sagittarius, knowledge from experience. Gemini is the here and now. Sag is to infinity and beyond. Gemini is probabilities. Sag is possibilities. Gemini is nervousness versus Sag is more easygoing. Gemini is curiosity versus Sag is conviction. Concrete versus abstract. And finally, Gemini is microscopic versus Sagittarius, which is telescopic.
Yeah, a lot of really interesting contrasts there. I think they're kind of two sides of a coin. I suppose that's why they're opposite in the zodiac, right? There's a useful kind of like there's a similarity between them, but then there's like some really interesting differences that make them work well together, but then also quite contrasting in other ways. I like to think of Mercury as like the significator of the student, and Jupiter as the significator of the teacher or like the guru figure. And so they can have, Gemini and Sagittarius can have this interesting relationship where Gemini's curiosity is satisfied by Sagittarius's like just vast reading and learning that they've done, and their enthusiasm to teach that. It's almost like a perfect pairing in a way, because Gemini is so interested in like what people have to say, and Sagittarius has a lot to say.
Right. I sometimes think about like Gemini has a reputation as a very chatty sign and is very good at like talking, but sometimes it can be like talking for the sake of talking versus Sagittarius. I sometimes think more about like thinking, like talking versus thinking. And something Gemini brings to the table that might be useful for Sagittarius is even if you know a lot of things with Sagittarius, or you're very learned in a number of different areas, or you've studied something very deeply, are you able to communicate that effectively to other people, through words or through writing or what have you, because those are not necessarily one and the same thing.
Yes. The exile or the detriment of Mercury is Sagittarius. So sometimes Sagittarius does have a difficult time of actually conveying all these profound truths, quote unquote, that they've found. How to actually communicate that to another person in a way that's compelling and holds their interest is sometimes a challenge, because Sag wants to talk about big things, controversial topics sometimes, like you mentioned, Ashley, and big brain stuff. Mercury might want to talk more about like what they did on the weekend,
Yeah, and I'm sorry, we wanted to talk at the same time, but I feel like they do complete each other in a way, and opposites are so similar that they do have qualities that mesh so well and almost can complete what that other sign can't. So like pieces of information with Gemini, the little pieces mixed with the big picture creates a connection, and it almost brings it back to reality. And then you think about the quality of air and fire, and how air fuels fire. So it's like we need each other. So I do like the way that they kind of complete each other. And they do hold this like never-ending youth quality. It's kind of like the Peter Pan kind of vibe. I know that might go more with Gemini, but I feel like they're both very young at heart signs. Playful, optimistic, friendly, social, and just love interacting for the sake of learning.
Yeah,
for sure.
There's a trouble with Gemini, like you said, Chris, preferring to talk rather than to listen. And I think that can sometimes drive Sagittarius a little bit crazy because they really have a lot to say. And they're like, I really, really want to like tell you about this thing that's inspiring me, or like that I learned the other day that's just blowing my mind. And Gemini just won't pass the microphone.
Yeah. And Gemini is also better about small talk, like making small talk, which is an art in and of itself. And like some people are really good at small talk, like having those short, quick interactions and making it positive and like effective or something like that. Whereas other people struggle with like a short conversation that they aren't able to like say what they want to say or get everything in.
Yeah. And like we talked about with Sag kind of being the one who likes to bring controversial issues to the table. It's like these big ideas and it's like, why are you bringing that to Thanksgiving dinner? And then Gemini is like, I'm just gonna chit chat on these little things that aren't that big and it's not really gonna upset people, but it probably still will, but not quite to the extent of like what Sag is going to be talking about.
Yeah. I actually like literally went on Twitter one day when I was going to a wedding. I didn't know a lot of people there and asked like for help like with small talk. So I kind of crowdsourced small talk ideas because my preference is to go straight into like whatever is my passion. And I want to talk about my passion with people. Yes. But I recognize that unless I'm around like friends, people I know well, I can't really do that. So I have to have something else to say to them. And so got a lot of helpful advice because I definitely do struggle with small talk. So yeah, and I do tend to bend the conversation towards philosophy, like whenever I can. So that is like absolutely true, at least from my experience. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can say the same.
Especially Mercury in Sagittarius sometimes has a difficulty knowing when to cut it off in terms of like talking too long or too much. And it makes me think of a famous Mercury in Sagittarius that I know, which is Robert Hand. And he has Cancer rising with the Sun and Mercury and Venus all in Sagittarius in the 6th whole sign house. And for years, he was just famous for his lectures. He was famous on the astrology lecture circuit, especially at the Northwest Astrology Conference that would happen around the end of May every year for like 30 years, starting in 1984. And he became kind of a centerpiece of that conference because he would always give this one last like rousing lecture at the very end of the very last day. And it was always this like very long and like sort of circuitous, but ultimately inspiring lecture that some people eventually came to call like refer to it casually as like the Sunday sermon, because it was like he was talking about astrology, but he was integrating these like broader metaphysical and philosophical concepts, even when he was talking about something like the history. And sometimes he would start off, and he famously, even if you listen to some of the past early podcast episodes of the Astrology podcast, where I had Rob on a few times, like he will just go on these digressions and you have no idea where he's going or how long this is going to go on for, or if it's going to come back. But eventually it'll always like curve back to the topic and like tie everything in perfectly, even though you were a little nervous for a little bit, or at least I was nervous as the host, like if it was going to come back around to the point. But he would always pull it off. And I often think of that when I think of Mercury and Sagittarius type people.
Digressions are like, most of my conversations are just a series of digressions sort of jammed together and glued together. And hopefully I get back to where I started at some point.
Right.
Yep. I can't tell you how many of my friends are like, or I'll be in a conversation and I'm like, blah, 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 this. Wait, what was I talking about? And then they have to remind me like, oh, you were talking about this. I'm like, okay, so actually the point of that whole thing was this, but now you know all this. So yeah, it's, I relate as well. And I don't know how, but it's kind of like a lightning bolt strikes, Zeus. Lightning bolt strikes. And it reminds me like, wait, you were actually focused on something, or you're supposed to be talking about one thing. So get back to it.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe to circle back to where we started from, which is Gemini, is like we can learn a lot from Geminis about how to like converse well and how to be engaging and how to hold court and to sort of just the sort of speaking skills and the charisma of a Gemini, because I think Sagittarius sometimes has a hard time like leaving the study or the library or the monastery or wherever we might be located and actually coming down to the town and conveying what we've been doing to people. Yeah
for sure. All right, I'm looking through examples to see if there's any chart examples that would be good for this contrast with Gemini right now, but I'm not necessarily seeing any that I super want to mention. Okay, so maybe that's good with the contrast with Gemini, aside from just small things versus big things is one of the big contrasts. And curiosity versus conviction, I thought was another good contrast, just in terms of the things that we've talked about here a little bit. Even though there's a curiosity and there's like a roaming quality to both, it seems like Mercury likes to keep things a little bit more surface level in terms of interest and curiosity and conversation versus the larger thing, or between like formulating beliefs and almost being a little ironically or unexpectedly a little bit more fixed in a way with Sagittarius.
I'm reminded of a good example of Gemini is a fellow astrology podcaster, Adam Sommer, and his way of conversing with people. He brings people on his podcast that he's interested in hearing from, and he has this kind of curious, let's hear from you approach. I think he invites people on based on whether he likes their work. He wants to just have a chat with them, and you can see his curiosity coming through. He likes to sort of like take little pieces from different things, and he's always like, oh, that's interesting that you say that. That's interesting that you say that. But he doesn't necessarily come down with like a really firm stance. He's quite happy to kind of hear from people and enjoy that interchange. Whereas a Sagittarius person will almost be like mounting a pulpit, to say like, right, here is the what I believe is true, and I'm going to try and make you believe it too. Whereas Gemini is more comfortable to just like hear alternative positions and alternative ways of thinking, but won't necessarily like adopt one and like hold firm to it in the way that Sagittarius will.
Yeah. And that's a good quality, I think, that Sag can learn from Gemini for sure, is just remember that it doesn't have to be so serious. It doesn't have to be so deep. I know we're the sign after Scorpio, but we can let go of the the deep stuff sometimes. And it is important to, how Gemini communicates, because they almost get so much more information from people that they can learn more about those people and in turn themselves. Whereas Sagittarius is like almost putting themselves on other people. Like, you're like me. And it's like, well, let's learn about each of you and see how we intertwine.
That's a good point.
For sure. And I'm trying to remember. I don't remember if Adam's chart is public. I think it is, but it just suffice to say as a contrast between some Gemini placements and some Sagittarius placements in his. Just to your point. It also reminds me, I forgot to mention at the beginning, like that I have some credentials, not as good as you guys in terms of your chart placements, but I've got some Sagittarius with my midheaven and my Uranus and Venus and Neptune there in the sign of Sagittarius in the 11th whole sign house. And I sometimes think about that, about in terms of how the podcast has become this thing where I, do these episodes with friends. And this is part of my career at this point, as both of you are like friends, and we're having this talk and this discussion about astrology today. And I've been able to like sort of make a whole career out of that with my midheaven in the sign of Sagittarius.
Because astrology is kind of like, there's a Jupiterian quality to it. I mean, lots of different planets can be associated with astrology. I think primarily Mercury in the tradition, and Uranus more recently. But there's a Jupiterian piece as well, I suppose, in the sense that it's a lofty topic and it's sort of a philosophical topic. And I think you, in your work, kind of, I've noticed that you always bring kind of a philosophical or thoughtful, but you bring that kind of thoughtful philosophical perspective to these topics, and you're happy to discuss things like philosophy, like whether it be Stoicism or like whether it be like other ways of thinking about astrology and the history of it and things like that fascinate you. And so it's interesting to see that the Sagittarius on the midheaven, that's sort of what you're known for, is sort of conveying this sort of high, lofty topic to people.
That's what I was just gonna say, is like you bring these huge ideas that like I've never comprehended until I've listened to your podcast, and then it's just like sparks all these other like, oh, maybe I should learn Sanskrit so I can learn all these big things.
Yeah, and if you go back and listen to like the very first episode of the Astrology podcast, what's funny is I had like a vision for what I wanted to accomplish, but it was so big, and like if you look at the actual outline of like what I said I wanted to do with the show, it looked a little bit ridiculous at the time and over the top, because I was like, I want to cover the history and the philosophy and the techniques, and we're going to talk about all the different astrological traditions, and we're going to talk about all the signs and planets, and it's going to cover everything. So there was this kind of like lofty or like overarching vision for it. But then over the past 10 years, sort of I've been able to slowly, using maybe the more Saturn part of my chart, like actually accomplish that by just doing pieces slowly over the course of the past decade.
Yes, because you're definitely accomplishing it. Like you're covering so much ground, and not many people could do that, but it takes that Sag energy to bring the heavens to the ground.
Yeah. And I've noticed also one of the ways I do it is by importing some of that. I think having Venus there and having that be my 11th house, I sometimes import people with Sag placements into my life in different ways. And I think that's helpful as well to balance out the other Scorpio and like Capricorn parts. Yeah. All right. So I think that's good for the contrast with Gemini and with Sagittarius. Unless either of you have anything else, maybe we could move on to talking about the contrast with some of the other signs.
Sure.
All right. So let's see. Why don't we, looking at the zodiac here, one of them that might be easy as a transition at this point that's very similar is just looking at the other, in the same quadruplicity or modality, the other mutable signs and what the similarities and differences are. Because one of the easy ones there is moving on to Virgo, which is the other Mercury-ruled sign. But instead of being an air sign like Gemini was, Virgo is an earth sign. So it's a little bit more practical and a little bit more grounded, even though it's focused on very small things or sort of like minute details. And I think this is where that contrast that I mentioned earlier of like, of Sagittarius knowing a lot of philosophical or big picture things. But I think if any sign knew like how to change a tire or something like that had like practical knowledge of smaller things, it would be Virgo as being part of the basic contrast, but also ways in which both of them, even though there's a tension there because there's differences, they're very different. They can in some ways be complementary.
Yes, it's that Mercury-Jupiter relationship comes through again. It's interesting how so Jupiter and Mercury, their domiciles are all mutable signs, and they oppose each other. And so there's this sort of intimate relationship between Mercury and Jupiter in the setup of the domicile rulership scheme that's not really so present with some of the other planets, perhaps. They sort of have this pairing quality, but they also like a contrasting quality too. I think. Yeah,
well, and it's like with the other contrast, it's a starker or harder to reconcile contrast with some of the other rulerships. Like it's, the two luminaries have Cancer and Leo and represent like light basically, or reflecting light, versus Saturn, which is opposite to that, which represents darkness. So there's much more of a strong contrast there, or almost like negation in a way. And similarly with the two Venus and Mars signs, like with Aries being ruled by Mars, opposite to Venus being ruled by Libra, or Taurus ruled by Venus, opposite to Mars ruled by Scorpio. Those are much more contrasting, sort of opposite combative sort of energies that are a little bit harder to reconcile. But then when you get to the Mercury and Jupiter signs, even though, because all of those, for example, are benefics opposite malefics, or light-giving planets opposite to a malefic or what have you. But when you get to Mercury and Jupiter, you've got a benefic that's opposite to a little bit more neutral of a planet. And while you can see some of their contrasts, I think they're a little bit more reconcilable sometimes, a little bit more easily at least, than some of the other contrasts.
Yeah, thank you for saying that better than I could, Chris. That's where I was really going for, is that there's a complementary quality between them that isn't necessarily present with the other pairings of the opposed signs. Yeah, because there's something about, there's a conflict, I suppose, between what Venus wants to do and what Mars wants to do. And there's a sort of a conflict between what Saturn wants to do and what the luminaries want to do. But with Mercury and Jupiter, they sort of have a shared kind of project in a way. Like Mercury wants to learn and Sag wants to teach, and Jupiter wants to teach. So there is something there where they kind of fulfill each other in a way, that whereas the other opposed pairings are more like butting heads, I guess. But that being said, there is differences. There is a potential conflict. Like when I think about Virgo and Sagittarius, I think about the way that Sagittarius exaggerates things and just sometimes says a lot of inaccurate things and makes broad generalizations and verbal gaffes. And that will just drive a Virgo crazy to sit there and listen to a Sagittarius like embellishing a story or exaggerating what happened. Where they're like, no, that's not actually what happened. That's inaccurate. Like you're not telling the truth here.
Those are really good keywords: embellishment or exaggeration for Sag.
And similarly with Sag, like that Sagittarius will get frustrated with Virgo's insistence on every little thing being correct, and they're missing the point. Like it doesn't matter that I used the wrong word
right
here. Like the vibe of what I'm saying is right.
Yeah. When I said like the misuse of the word literally or something, like, no, I didn't literally go to the moon. I just meant I was very excited. And Virgo's like, but you said you literally went to the moon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I do like how you mentioned Mercury being a more comfortable sign with all of the other or a more comfortable planet with the others. Because I feel like it almost lends a more mutable quality to the already mutable signs. So it makes it less harsh of a contrast sometimes.
There's more flexibility.
Yeah, there's more like Virgo too. You think of being kind of in service to people. And they're, even though they may be bothered by like, hey, why did you say that? I was there. And that's not how it went down. They may be more flexible and being like, okay, Sag, like, I'll just let you have that, So that's interesting. I'd like to ponder that a little bit more, but I like that you pointed that out because Mercury will make it a little bit more adaptable to not being so different, even though there are squares and oppositions with these signs.
Yeah, for sure. I think of going back to like David Pingree's chart, because he had that Mercury in Sagittarius with Venus, but it was in a mutual reception with Jupiter in Virgo. And so there's this positive flowing exchange between those two signs. And I think that's where you get the best of both worlds, where he had this, very broad base of learning about many different cultures and histories and philosophies and types of astrology. But then he put it to a practical use by he would go back and make critical editions of different texts where he'd gather up like all of the manuscripts of this one ancient astrology text, and he would compare all of them and then write out and recreate what he thought the original manuscript of the original text was. And he did this with like not just the Yavana Jataka in Sanskrit, but he also did that with Vedic Valens. Like he's the one that did the critical edition of Vedic Valens that we drew on for the translation that I just published, that Mark Riley translated, that I published a few months ago. He also translated like 10 other critical editions, or he didn't translate them because he did it in the original language. So if you pick up that text of Valens, it's not a translation, it's the original text of Valens, or at least what Pingree thought it was in Greek. But There's a very practical component to that, which is the Virgo side of things.
Virgo gives something that Sagittarius needs in some ways. And a chart like Pingree's where there's both, it's like a superpower because you've got that big picture perspective, but then you can also actually do the detailed, careful work so that your big ideas can actually be backed up with, look at, I've done all here's my receipts, Yeah. And so without that mercurial part, without that sort of Virgo part, Sagittarius's ideas can be shot down, can be like holes can be knocked in them, and the big lofty, like spiritual or religious, whatever it might be, take that you have gets criticized, and then you're left in the ashes.
Yeah, I think Sagittarius might sometimes feel a little tension there because Virgo is probably much more critical and much more has an ability to see and focus on the details and the cracks and something and the mistakes because it focuses on that microscopic part of things versus Sagittarius wanting to look at the big picture. And I think there might be tension there between the two of them as a result of that, but it's not, irreconcilable.
Yeah, and I almost feel like Virgo brings practicality to Sagittarians' ideas, whereas like Gemini and Sag kind of make it like fun, or it may not be like super like, oh, let's make something out of this. Like they just want to talk about it. They just want to be in that moment together. Whereas Virgo, being Earth too, wants to ground it. They want to like, is there a purpose for this? If you have all these big ideas, then how can we like use that in reality? Or how can I improve this medical book with this like mythological or ancient knowledge or whatever it may be. But I feel like Virgo will help make it like more grounded in reality.
Yeah. Sagittarius needs help to actually make a practical difference. And that's where the Virgo can come in and be really, really helpful. Yeah.
And in turn, Sagittarius probably helps Virgo to lighten up a little bit and not always focus on the straight and narrow and not everything has to be practical all the time or useful or grounded.
Yeah, that's it. Add a bit of levity, and Sagittarius helps Virgo to see the forest for the trees as well, so they can help Virgo like zoom out a little bit and not worry so much. Don't stress the details so much.
Yeah.
Right. For sure. All right. That might be good contrasting that one. The only mutable sign then, which will run into very similar themes we haven't contrasted yet, is Pisces, which in traditionally in ancient astrology is also ruled by Jupiter. It's also a mutable sign, and it's a feminine or nocturnal sign like Virgo, but the difference is that this is a water sign. So water being the primary difference in the contrast, but it's the other Jupiter-ruled sign. So we've got major similarities between Sagittarius and Pisces, but the difference is fire versus water.
I have some thoughts on that, but I wonder, Ashley, did you want to perhaps go first? I've got some things to say, but...
You go ahead.
Cool. I'll dive in. I'm just conscious of my Aries rising. Sometimes I just want to...
No, you're good.
Just to start before the gun's even fired.
My Taurus rising will gladly follow.
Cool. I think that's, the fiery side of Jupiter comes out in Sagittarius, but there's this other side to Jupiter that comes through in Pisces. There's a more like contemplative side. There's a more like meditative approach with Pisces as opposed to like the more active and like I think about like the difference between sitting still and contemplating and meditating as like a spiritual practice like Jupiter versus something more like active, like standing up and giving a sermon or like leading prayers and things like that might be more of a Sagittarius angle. Pisces has that watery side, which is so valuable and it allows them to tap into the emotional and felt and sensitive space, so they can they have more of a capacity to be like a healer or like a like a helper, whereas Sagittarius is more like a fighter in some ways. So Sagittarius wants to take the banner up and go charging off and like spread the word, like with fire and sword. But Pisces has that sort of more caring component. The Jupiter wants to help people. I think helpfulness is an important Jupiter keyword, but we see two different sides to that in these two signs, where Sagittarius wants to help by like teaching and by sort of conveying and also just fighting for truth is a way of helping. I think Pisces has an access to more of like an inner truth and an ability to kind of sit with people, sit with their feelings and share space with them in a way that Sagittarius isn't quite so capable of. That was sort of the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah, I can definitely see that too, where like Pisces is more of, they're willing to maybe work on a deeper level with people and like understanding and working through this knowledge and using it to like help their inner souls and selves and working with them. Whereas Sag is kind of like, okay, here you go. Now here's the information. You know how to use it, right? Here you go. And Pisces is like, let me nurture you while teaching this in a way.
Yeah, the more nurturing side of Jupiter. Yes, I think that's a really good point. Like, it's a water sign, so it has that like fertility and that sort of like, let me like help you to grow. Let me like, it's more of a kinder teacher in a way, like a more gentle teacher, whereas Sagittarius might be the more like tough, strict teacher. I'm thinking like, what did I have to say? There's an inclusive and accepting quality to Pisces that's absent in Sagittarius.
There's empathy. I think empathy is one of the big keywords here for Pisces. I'm thinking of keywords like empathy, softer, and it's sort of like the difference where Sagittarius would be like the political organizer versus Pisces is the person who becomes like a vegetarian or a vegan through a love of animals and like empathy for animals or something like that, and not wanting to harm them. So almost like withholding doing something or not doing something, withholding action of like, eating another human being through, or another sentient being through just sheer empathy. And that's more of a Pisces thing to me.
Yeah. And I feel like Sag is almost a little bit more like intellectualizing these things, whereas Pisces is making it a lot more emotionally driven. So they have these like passions in a way, and they are supportive, but exactly like you said, like Sag is more pushing it on people, and Pisces is maybe gonna like sit with it and take it a little deeper. You think water, it is grounded, it like goes lower than any other element, and then fire rises and it's just maybe focused on its own rising, whereas water is trying to nourish everything with this information.
Fire burns, it hurts people. And I think the last thing Pisces wants to do is to hurt. They want that's sort of counter to the goal.
Water heals, fire hurts.
Yeah.
And in that way, Pisces and water, conforms and adapts to what's around it and can be more willing to go along with what somebody else is saying, or willing to be adaptable to somebody, versus I think Sagittarius, which can be a little bit more wanting to do its own thing and more independent, and will sometimes, like, even though optimistic in some ways, will get into conflict with people if there are differences of like a belief or opinion.
Yeah, it's more of a righteousness with Jupiter. With Sagittarius, that fiery, like that we're full of like vim and vigor, and we want to like, and we're prepared to fight because like the fire signs are like have that combative quality. Sagittarius will get into arguments and things like that, whereas I think Pisces wants to like, like hold space for different views and understand where people are coming from more. Whereas Sagittarius has perhaps more of that quality of like, no, I know that I'm right about this.
Sag is more ego driven, I feel like.
Yes. Yes.
Whereas Pisces is like, this is for everybody's healing, not just for your ego.
There's a brashness and a boldness with fire signs, and so you get a brash and bold version of Jupiter in Sagittarius, whereas you get a more empathetic and more like sensitive version of Jupiter in Pisces.
Yeah. And Pisces also, in its keywords, is just being very conflict averse.
Yes.
I've noticed is a major Pisces thing, and that is a contrast a bit, I think, with Sagittarius.
Yeah.
Similarities, though, is being both mutable signs. I think both can have a reputation for being like a little bit flaky, or because of that aggressive quality of both as mutable signs. Maybe not, sticking to one thing, but kind of being a little bit all over the place, or having multiple things going, or maybe having good intentions, but then not following through as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, both signs are prone to sort of taking on too many things, and then the follow through is the difficult part. Yeah, absolutely. And that the positive side to the mutability is this: both signs, I think, go on journeys in life. Like, not, I don't like necessarily, just to digress, I don't necessarily like this idea that Sagittarius is always traveling, because I feel like that is just that's sort of a symptom of the alphabetic zodiac, where you relate Sagittarius to the 9th house, because I know plenty of Sagittariuses that have never left the country, let alone their bedroom. But I do think there is something to this idea of like a spiritual journey, or like an inner journey, or moving from one belief or faith to another, or like going like a path of learning, a path of discovery. And both signs share that like moving from one thing to another, on a quest for like on a sort of a faith-based quest, or like a belief-based quest. Yeah.
And I feel like in a way that makes them both creative also. I feel like I see a lot of really artistic Pisces, of course. And then I also know a lot of artists that are Sagittarian. So I don't know if that just also makes them creative. It is like a higher minded kind of thing. And all these things that they're learning, they can use to create.
Yeah, creativity is an important Jupiter trait. And I think in some of the medieval natal astrology books I've got, they use Jupiter when it comes to the topic of children. So they'll look at Jupiter as like one of the universal significators for this topic of children. So in addition to the 5th house, you'd also look at someone's Jupiter placement to see where children are going to come into someone's life. There's a generative quality to Jupiter. Maybe that's perhaps linked to, and this is probably getting a bit esoteric, but Jupiter is the god of the sky, and the rain falls from the sky and fertilizes. So there's like a nurturing quality to Jupiter in both, but perhaps more so in Pisces. We get more of that like rain god perspective with the Pisces version of Jupiter.
I do think there's a little something to being a diurnal or masculine sign, more of like an externalization of the traveling, or at least exploratory quality in Sagittarius, whether it's like explorations of the mind, or to different cultures, or learning different politics or philosophies or what have you, whereas there's more of an internal exploration quality with Pisces, of like the person that goes on like a LSD trip or something like that, and like finds their spirit animal or like something like that, or which can sometimes have a negative quality in terms of like escapism, being a Pisces sort of quality that sometimes comes up through different forms of that, or different pitfalls that come along with that. But that's an interesting like internal versus externalization of a similar impulse of sort of like exploration.
Yeah, the journey in versus the journey out.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point, Chris. Yeah.
I keep thinking about that.
Oh, go ahead.
I'll just say it really quickly. I keep thinking about that over and over again the further into the series I go, of just conceptualizing the diurnal signs and the masculine signs as being like the sun, and that the sun like radiates light out, versus the moon and the nocturnal signs, or the feminine signs, and the notion of the light coming in and reflecting like sort of like inwards in an internalization of the quality or the impulse.
Mhm.
What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I know you guys mentioned not really loving the association of Sagittarius with like physical travel. And I agree, because I'm a Sag that I really don't love to physically travel a whole lot. But I feel like that's maybe why Sagittarius is represented by more like physical travels, is just because it is a more external sign, whereas Pisces is the internal, and maybe Pisces' internal journey inspires them to eventually take an external travel journey, whereas opposite with Sag, like you go to another country, learn these other languages or learn about their cultures, and then maybe that will teach them or make them want to learn more internally. So it's like starting from internal, going external, and starting external, going internal.
I like that. Yeah, these binary qualities kind of there's like a relationship there and like a flow happening. Yeah. It's helpful to think about these as like the directionality to like moving in versus moving out, and like the journey outwards from within, the journey, both ways. I think that's a really fascinating way to think about it.
And they're all mutable. So, the mutability of going internal and external, they're able to do that.
Yeah, for sure. One of the last points that Camille makes is both share in common a desire to sincerely help others. And I think that's a really good point about Sagittarius and Pisces, that there can be this underlying component, for the most part, that most share in wanting to help people.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes. Pisces wants to, it sort of explores that how can I help people in a felt space, in a space of like emotional depth, in our psychology, our feelings, our sensitivities, our that inner world. And Sagittarius has more of a like, how can I help people grapple with these big questions in their lives, and more of an externalized kind of approach. They both are concerned with other people. They're both concerned with sharing what they've learned, but they have a different mode or different sort of way of going about that process.
Yeah. And I almost feel like all the mutable signs are pretty concerned with helping people. Of course, Virgo, I feel like, is associated naturally to helping people, but Gemini also, they all just do it in a different way. And it is genuinely wanting to help people or have people connect, whether it be to others or to themselves.
All right. Well, I think that's enough. That's enough talking about the water signs. Why don't we focus now that we've completed talking about the mutable signs, the four mutable signs of Gemini, Sagittarius, Virgo, and Pisces. I'm going to talk about the other set of signs that Sagittarius shares in common or has a close connection with through a similarity, is the other fire signs, which are Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. So here's the diagram. We've talked about this a little bit already, but why don't we start with Aries and contrast it with Sagittarius. So Aries is ruled by Mars. It's also a fire sign, but it's cardinal because it comes at the beginning of the seasons, and it's also a masculine or diurnal sign. So in terms of that, one of the contrasts that Camille came up with was that Aries is like a firework. It shoots off quickly and sort of explodes fast, and there's a blaze of sort of glory, but then it's over relatively quickly as a cardinal sign. And then she says that Leo is like a fireplace, and Sagittarius is like a wildfire.
Yes, I had the exact same analogy written down. Yeah, like cardinal Aries is like the spark that starts the fire, or like a firework's a good analogy as well. And then the fireplace, Leo, is where the fire is held and contained and maintained and made sure that fire doesn't go out. Yeah. And there's a warming kind of like, let's all gather around the fire quality. But mutable fire is spreading, and it's being shared. And in a positive way, that could be, lighting torches and passing them out to the community. But it could also be like a raging bushfire or like a forest fire that just is out of control. And that's a really great way to like start thinking about the other fire signs for sure.
Yeah, and I have something kind of similar to that in my notes. So the firework, fireplace, wildfire are kind of like these different forms of fires. But my way of looking at it is like the different progressions of a single fire. So I think of, like you said, the Aries is kind of like the spark. You're igniting it, you're lighting the fire. The Leo is the roaring fire, literally. Lion, it's roaring fire, it's blazing.
Love that.
And then I see Sag as kind of like the smoldering, burning embers afterward. It's like a little bit cooler fire, but it burns deep.
Yeah, and those coals, you know, like there's still warmth there, but there's sort of like a spread out quality to them, you know, raking over the coals and things like that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And fire, I mean, is it's a creation kind of thing. Like it destroys, but it also allows for creation or new things to begin.
Yes. We forge things in the fire. We make tools and things. Yes, absolutely.
Yep.
And Leo has that sort of like, this is the hearth that we can gather around. But maybe mutable Sagittarius is like taking that fire and like sharing it out and like let's move from maintaining it to giving it out to people and sort of passing it around. So passing that inspiration, like Aries is the spark of inspiration. Leo is like the storehouse of it. And Sagittarius is the person who's going to take that out and like give it to the community and teach it and share it.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. And pass it on. That's really good.
Yeah.
So initiate, maintain, and then like pass on or transfer in some way.
Yeah, transference. Because I think the mutable signs have that transferring or transforming quality at the end of the season. There's a shifting between. That's sort of like the nature of that modality is to pass between two states.
Right, because it's at the end of the season, so you're going from the fixed quality of the middle of the season to starting to transition into the next one and what you learned from that last season that you're going to carry forward into the next one.
Yeah, like every day I light incense in my room, but what I do is I get my cigarette lighter and I light the candle, and I think the cigarette lighter is the Aries. The candle is Leo, and then I light my incense from the candle, and that sort of like taking the fire and spreading it to some other thing, and also I suppose incense being something that's often used in prayer and meditation seems fitting, you know. Yeah.
And you can light as many incense as you want from that one flame that already stands. I like that.
The candle holds it, and then we're going to take that and like share it out. Yeah.
So other similarities. So like I said earlier, Aries likes to go very fast. Sagittarius also, I think fast is a pretty good keyword for Sagittarius to some extent. Maybe not as impulsive. I don't think Sag is quite as impulsive as Aries, but there still can be kind of like a shoot from the hip quality to both of them to a certain extent.
Yes. Jupiter, that optimism comes in. So, you know, all the fire signs have that energetic quality. Aries is cardinal, so it's the most energetic and the most quick. Leo, the least of them because it's fixed. So it's a little bit slower in pace, but it still has that fire inside it. Sagittarius is not fixed at all. So it you can see the quickness and that energy, you know, more clearly in Sagittarius than you can in Leo. Yeah. And they both have another thing that I think is shared with Aries is this sort of courageous or brave. I mean, all the fire signs have it actually. This bravery. Aries is not afraid to explore and new territory and dive in to things. And Sagittarius is not afraid of exploring like new ideas or like being like a thought leader or something like that, you know? Yeah. A similar kind of boldness.
That's a great point. Like courage, brave, also independent. I think all three of the fire signs share that quality of independence or valuing independence. Aries has that in that they're willing to be the first one into the breach or the first one to like run out ahead of everybody else and has this courageousness partially as a result of that. sometimes bordering on a little bit of, I don't know what the downside of that is, but like foolhardiness or
recklessness. Yeah.
Recklessness. Yeah, that's really good for Aries. Leo has also an independent streak, but it's through that Leo just wants to shine and have its own internal qualities radiate from itself, and has this internal sense of just like feeling solid in and of itself, and feeling good about itself, to the point of sometimes being like egotistical or narcissistic as the downside of that. But the other side of that that's more positive is just being comfortable being who you are, and radiating or showing off your own light or your own internal qualities in a way that it draws other people to you, or makes other people want to gravitate towards you, or situate themselves around you as sort of like the center of the solar system in some way, like the sun does with the planets. So Sagittarius similarly finally has also some similarities in terms of an independent quality.
Yeah. And they all have like their own leadership quality too, because like Aries starts everything, right? That's a leader. But then Leo is always known as the leader, right? Because they're like that steady leader almost. And then Sagittarius is a leader in the sense that like, I'm going to change your life with all these ideas. I'm going to kind of spark inspiration in a way. So they do all have like leadership qualities.
It's a really good point. Yeah, there's something about the fire element that lends itself well to being in a leadership role. But that's a really great analogy. Yeah, Mars is sort of like the leading from the front, if you like the general in the army who's actually in the front ranks, and like, I'm right here with you. I'm right at the front of the battle, and you can see, here I am, here's my banner. Leo, the king or the queen, like that sort of the centrality of Leo. The hearth is in the center of the house. We gather around the hearth, and the planets get, orbit around the sun. Yes, it's all really good stuff. And yeah, Jupiter is the inspirational leader. Like Winston Churchill is a Sagittarius, and he was very well known for inspiring people, and like he was very optimistic during a really dark time for Britain, when they were pretty much the only country in the world that was still fighting the Nazis. And it looked pretty bleak. But his speeches and his kind of like optimism comes through to inspire. So there's a leadership quality there. Oh, Chris, you put the chart up for Winston. Yes.
Yeah. So for those listening to the audio version, Winston Churchill had the Sun and Venus in Sagittarius.
Yeah. And I think he has a charismatic quality to him. I mean, I'm not a massive admirer of Winston Churchill, let me be clear. I just think it's a great example of someone who leads through inspiration, and it's like sort of radiating optimism that got Britain through a very like scary period in their history. Yeah. What other things can we say?
Well, and the optimism mixed with the leadership stuff, it's kind of like a cheerleader. I feel like fire signs kind of tend toward that archetype too, whether it be like a cheerleader or just someone, they're there to encourage you in one form or another with optimism.
That's it. Yeah. It's infectious quality of like, you can see that there's always energy in the fire signs, and they have different ways of communicating that to other people. Aries almost through example, Leo through like this sort of radiating quality, and Sagittarius maybe through like a sharing and like a kind of let me go out into the world, and I will take this with me and give it to you. Yeah.
Check out this quote I just found from Winston Churchill, where, assuming this is correct, he said, "An optimist sees an opportunity in every calamity. A pessimist sees a calamity in every opportunity."
Isn't that perfect?
That's perfect. Yeah, that's a very saggy quote.
Yes.
I was going to think about the differences between the ruling planets, perhaps, Chris. Like, Aries is Mars ruled. This is a malefic planet, and has a combative quality to it. While Jupiter, while it can be combative because it's, while Sagittarius can be combative because it's fire sign, because it's ruled by a benefic, it really prefers to reconcile and prefers to like find common ground and prefers to be in a space of joviality, of happiness and pleasantry. Like, I don't think Sagittarius naturally wants to get into a fight. I think the problem is that they just find themselves there because they have a very strong belief in something, and then that clashes with someone else's belief. Mm-hmm. So there's like more combative quality with Aries as opposed to Sagittarius is a bit more a bit more inclined to wanting people to get along, let's say. They want everyone to have a good time at the party. They don't want people fighting. But if you disagree with me and like you're really adamant about it, like we're gonna have to sort this out.
We will get martial if we need.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Aries will like challenge you to a race or something like that. Or,
Jupiter Sagittarius might be a bit more aloof from things like that. Like I'm not really interested in cars, man.
Right.
Yeah, and the other thing that I struck by with like Leo and Sagittarius, they both have like a noble quality to them. The traditional sort of significations of the sun is like the king or the ruler, the authority figure, and Jupiter sort of related in a way. It sort of signifies nobility and people who are like aristocrats essentially. So they both have like a ruling quality, or like these are the sort of the people at the top end of society, I mean, like medieval society. People would think about the nobility as Jupiterian, but the royalty as being solar. So there's a shared kind of pride. I think Sagittarius, I mentioned earlier, has like a proud quality to it, and it's perhaps straying into arrogance. And that's something that it shares with Leo, is that they're very concerned with being respected. And when they feel disrespected, that's when the fire really comes out.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe just again that notion of fire in the ancient conceptualization of the four elements and the order of the cosmos, and that notion of fire rising up to the top of all other, compared to all other elements.
Yeah.
And wanting to be seen. Like Jupiter's a huge planet, and so it may be far away, but like we're very aware, and it's seen. And then the sun.
Bright.
Is the center of the solar system. Like it is very seen. It creates life. And so they're very seen planets. They want to be seen. They're comfortable in being in the public eye, I guess, in a way.
It's a great point. Yeah. The size of Jupiter. Jupiter's the only thing that comes even close to the sun in terms of size in the solar system. Yeah.
And I went out last night and the moon was pretty close to Jupiter in the middle of the sky. And it was just like the brightest star in the sky that you can see that just like stands out, especially, in the middle of the night compared to the moon and compared to all of the other stars. It's just sort of radiates its brilliance.
Yeah. And that shows too that like you can almost see it a little bit better at night, right? So Sagittarius is maybe more comfortable with like dipping from diurnal to nocturnal kind of realms, and maybe Leo's a little more comfortable with just the diurnal.
Yeah. So another thing that comes up that we've talked about a little bit, but that comes up with Leo, and Camille wrote this down, but keywords of like expression and authenticity being very important to Leo, and it sharing that in common with Sagittarius. Like we were talking earlier about how like comedians, for example, with Sagittarius, that they don't want to be encumbered or like held back. They want to be able to express themselves authentically through comedy, and to be authentic in that way and not be stifled. And that's also very similar with Leo, where self-expression for Leo and being authentic is a very core value, I think, for Leo.
Yes, they both are interested in truth and honesty and authenticity, certainly. I had this sort of a joke thing that Sagittarius is honest about everything except ourselves. There's sort of a self-deception sometimes with Sagittarius, or we have like a self-image that maybe isn't grounded. But yeah, they both of these signs very concerned with speaking the truth and being true to themselves and things like that. Yeah.
I think that might be good for the triplicity of the fire triplicity, comparing these similarities and differences between those three signs. So what that leaves us with, I believe, is the aversions at this point.
Have we done the sextiles?
Oh yeah, no, I've like skipped the sextiles. Sextiles aren't important, so we'll.
We don't need those.
Yeah,
Very soft aspect.
Continuing the ancient tradition of disregarding downplaying sextiles. All right, so good point. So Sagittarius is sextile to two signs. The first sign it's sextile to is Libra, and the second sign it is sextile to is Aquarius. So it finds itself in the middle, essentially, of the two of the air signs. One of them ruled by the other benefic Venus, which is Libra in a cardinal air masculine / diurnal sign. And then the other is Aquarius, which traditionally is ruled by Saturn and is a cold, fixed air sign, which is also masculine or diurnal.
The sextiles are a great aspect for a synastry because of that. I think there's a friendliness to the sextile. If you look at the horoscope, like with the first house being the person, then the third house, which is in a sextile to the first, is associated often with like close companions and kindred. And the 11th house is also in a sextile to the first house, and the 11th is friends and allies. So there's something like quite complementary and like close knit about Aquarius and Libra and Sagittarius. I think they get along well generally, and I know a lot of people who like couples who like have a Sagittarius and a Libra or a Sagittarius and an Aquarius, including myself.
Yes. Siblings and friends, basically.
Yeah. Libra has like a few interesting things. Like it's ruled by a benefic planet, similarly to Sagittarius. So they both have this shared interest in like fun and pleasure and like bringing joy to people. They want the sunny side of life, they want to enjoy things. And they want other people to have an enjoyable time as well. The difference there perhaps is that Sagittarius seeks beauty and inspiration, from ideas and concepts and things like that, whereas Libra has more of a sociability, a social side to it. So there's a different way that they bring forth those like that enjoyment of life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just talking about Libra, I feel like Libra, just like a difference. Libra's a little bit more people pleasing or wants to get along with everybody and doesn't really want to create any tension. Whereas Sag and Jupiter just really, they don't care if they create a little bit of tension. Like we talked about before, Sag loves creating a little bit of, maybe you should think about that a little bit more. And then Libra's like, oh yeah, I love your idea, even though I don't agree, but I'm not going to say it, So that's something that I notice. And they do get along really well, but that's a big difference I see.
Mm-hmm. I can see Libra cringing when Sagittarius brings up like religion and politics at the family dinner,
Right.
Yeah. Like, let's make this peaceful. Not today.
Yeah. Libra's very good with like social decor and things and being conscious of that.
And Sag will break that. Yeah. Because Sagittarius is like freedom, it wants the freedom to just, I wanted to say what I want to say.
It's the authenticity thing. It can't help but be authentic, even if it sometimes means like sticking your foot in your mouth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great Sagittarius trait, like a keyword almost. Well, not a keyword, but key phrase would be like foot in mouth syndrome. It's definitely a Sagittarius problem. Yeah.
Definitely. And then I guess we could look at like the symbolism too, the scales with Libra, and then the centaur with Sagittarius. They have balancing qualities in a way. I mean, of course, Libra has the scales of balance, but then Sagittarius is always working on the balance of that animal instinct and that humanity side. So there's that kind of duality there. Forgot what else I was going to say.
No, that's a really good point. There's Sagittarius balances like it's sort of to get into like medieval psychological terminology, but they would sort of talk about someone having an animal soul and then a rational soul, like the animal soul being like the the part of you that wants to just eat food and have sex and,
Yes.
like
Primal.
that stuff. Yeah, primal, exactly. Yeah.
Mhm.
And Sag has that like in spades. Like they're often like big eaters and like have sometimes a bad reputation for being quite flirty and like, being very interested in sex and in like the opposite, just meeting people and getting along, you know what I mean?
Yep.
But there's also that and then that gets balanced with their intellectual side and their interest in like high ideas and things. So they have to kind of find a balance between the earthy, like animal stuff and the sort of higher like philosophical things as well.
Yes. Yeah.
That's an interesting point that both Libra and Sagittarius can have like a flirty quality.
Yeah, that's
a
true.
good point.
Yes.
Definitely. Very social beings.
Right.
Yeah.
Very social. I think that's a really good thing that they can be like the social, and Sagittarius more like the sort of the life of the party. Whereas Venus or Libra wanting to go around and make sure everyone's like having a good time and doing well at the party or what have you.
Yeah. Absolutely. One other quality. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ashley.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say that one difference between them is the modality. So Libra is cardinal, so it's more active and more driven. And I think that Libra might get frustrated sometimes with Sagittarius spending too much time in like the armchair or in the study and not enough time actually out there getting things done and achieving results.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah, and that'll come up to a certain extent also with the other cardinal sign, which is Capricorn.
Yes. One other thing I just want to say, and then we can move on if you want. But I feel like they both have something to do with justice.
Yes.
I see the scales relating to justice, definitely, in judges. But I know that Sagittarius has had those qualities as well and has been associated in the past with like judging, and maybe in different forms. Sag is their own kind of like moral internal judging, and then Libra is balancing it for the community, I guess. Justice.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, it's something that they both definitely share, is a strong sense of justice and what's fair and what's right. And there is a difference in where they derive that from, I guess. Like you're absolutely correct, Ashley. Sagittarius has that felt sense of justice, like, or they derive it from their own
laws.
Yeah, it's almost like laws. A moral or religious code, or having like a philosophical, sense of what's right and what's wrong with Sagittarius, versus with Libra, it's more of like a social sense of what would bring balance socially between two people when you're contrasting opposite opinions or opposite desires.
Yes. Very much.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so that's good maybe for Sagittarius and Libra. So moving on to the other air sign that is sextile, we're talking about Sagittarius and Aquarius, where we get a contrast with a Saturn-ruled sign, but it's a Saturn-ruled sign that is also a diurnal or masculine sign. So there's a little bit more of a easier or more flowing relationship to some extent, or more complementary relationship with Sagittarius and Aquarius than there is with Sagittarius and Capricorn.
Yeah, they're definitely. I think it's a great contrast, Capricorn and Sagittarius versus Aquarius and Sagittarius. Because I think Aquarius is a more complementary energy for Sagittarius. Air and fire, mix well. Fire needs air to live, and Aquarius has that ability to kind of keep a Sagittarius going in a way. And you can, like, I know this personally because my partner's is at Aquarius, so I don't want to draw on that relationship too much. I want to kind of like zoom out more broadly. But that's in the back of my mind all the time when I talk about Aquarius. But I think one thing that Sagittarius really loves about Aquarius is the way that Aquarius is prepared to reject tradition, and that appeals to their love of freedom. There's a sort of a similarity there where Sagittarius looks at an Aquarius in the way that they're just doing their own thing, living their own life, and like not caring about what's proper or what's sort of like what's the traditional way. and that inspires them. And there's also this great quality that Aquarius has of like living out their ideals, because they're a Saturn ruled sign. They don't just have an ideal; they actually like put it into practice and live it out in their life. There's a groundedness to the idealism and like kind of a realism. I guess we get that with both Saturnian signs. There's sort of a more realistic take, and Sagittarius kind of needs that. It needs to have someone there who can bring them a bit more down to earth. And so that's another great quality that Aquarius has, to actually like take those ideas and those high-minded concepts and then put in the hard work to bring it about in reality.
And with that energy, I feel like they both kind of like perpetuate or create change or like disruptions that could be beneficial to the community, especially with Aquarius. And I'm just thinking about like mythologically how I believe both planets, Saturn and Jupiter, were like the gods of the gods.
Yes.
And so they kind of have this like authoritarian, in a way, it could be negative, like a god complex sort of thing, or they both share but my ideas are right. I see that a lot with Aquarius as well.
Yes. That's the sort of the trouble I think that sometimes Sagittarius has with Aquarius, is that Aquarius is fixed, and so it knows what it knows. Its ideals and its beliefs are set in stone and can't easily be budged, whereas Sagittarius likes to sort of flow more and like grow in its ideal, and like will shift from one ideal to another, or will learn about a new philosophy or a new way of thinking and adopt that. Whereas Aquarius is like, no, I reject that.
I'm fixed in this.
That's a good point, because like they both can share an ideological dogmatism with, in common. They can both be dogmatic ideologically, but Sagittarius is a little bit more flexible and maybe a little bit more willing to explore other options, whereas as a fixed Saturn-ruled sign, Aquarius, once it's sort of established something, can be a little bit more stuck in its ways, or a little bit more obstinate about not changing.
I like the word resolute for Aquarius. This is sort of like, I have thought about this, and I have a firm view on it now, and it will take a lot to budge an Aquarius from that view once they've formed it.
Both are very somewhat intellectual signs. One is a fire sign, and the other is an air sign. And I really liked what you said earlier, Rob, about rejecting social convention for Aquarius, because that's a very common thing that comes up over and over again, and I think is an outgrowth of the Saturn rulership, because Saturn likes to reject things, and it's sort of opposite to Leo and opposite to the Sun, of like rejecting that which is popular, or that which everything else is revolving around, which is like Leo and the Sun. And Saturn and Aquarius sets itself apart by standing outside of that, or opposite to that in some ways. And I think in that way, you're right that Sagittarius sometimes can get along well with, or can admire that in Aquarius, because it sees it in itself in terms of that desire for authenticity, basically, and being authentic above all else.
Yes. Yeah. I'm trying to think of something that they don't get there. What are some problems maybe? Like, I think there's I already mentioned the fixed versus mutable kind of clash a little bit. One other thing, it's probably in a similar vein with the modalities, is that Aquarius tends to like things to be organized and ordered, whereas I think there's more of a chaotic quality to Sagittarius. Like they're happy to live with mess and chaos in their lives a bit more, whereas Aquarius would like to have everything neat and tidy.
To plan things out. Yeah, to plan things out versus to have things sort of like up in the air and just sort of like to think on your feet, or to not necessarily plan out exactly what's going to happen in the future, but to kind of leave your schedule open to some extent.
Yes, I'm reminded of that earlier example of the astrologer who just bought a bunch of video equipment and just set out to just, because this will work out for sure,
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
And Aquarius would not like that approach. Would prefer to have a plan and have a structure, a Saturnian structure to things. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And in that way, that can be part of attention is there can be a little bit more of a pessimism to Aquarius as a Saturn ruled sign, or a focus or ability to see the faults or the defects in some things, to see the shortcomings in something, and it tries to plan for the future by like anticipating those things so as to avoid making those mistakes. But there can be a critical quality to that is similar to Capricorn, but not quite as internalized with Aquarius. And I think that can be a little bit of the difference between Aquarius and Sagittarius.
Yeah. Yes. Both of the Saturnian signs have a realism to them and like a pessimism to some extent.
Yes. Pessimism.
Yeah. And Sag doesn't like that. Doesn't like being told that things won't work out, or like, Sag needs to believe in the possibility of a better future.
I feel like Sag wants to look at the bright side, and Aquarius wants to look at like the dark side a little bit, or is comfortable with it at least.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Saturn and Aquarius also as an air sign can be cold, and there can be like this scientific, sterile, like sort of coldness to it a little bit as well, in terms of looking at the future and other things. Whereas with Sagittarius, it's a bit more warmer, a bit more optimistic. They can both be forward thinking, though, in a way, which is kind of interesting and similar in terms of the two of them.
Yeah. Yeah, they're both future oriented. The difference is that I think Aquarius approaches the future with like this is maybe something that might work out badly, and how do I make sure that doesn't happen? Whereas Jupiter is more Sagittarius is like looking towards the future with like excitement and like optimism and hope. I think Aquarius is a little bit worried about hope and worried about like whether that's going to be misplaced or it's going to lead you to some like bad outcomes.
Right. All right. So I think that's good for the sextile signs. Where are we at? We've done Scorpio and Capricorn for the most part as the sign that comes before and the sign that's after. Are the only two we're missing are the two otherwise aversion signs of Taurus and Cancer?
Yeah. I think so.
Do you want to talk about Taurus, Ashley, maybe?
Taurus.
So Taurus is ruled by Venus. It's an earth sign. It's fixed, and it's a nocturnal or feminine sign. So part of the issue here is it shares nothing in common in terms of those qualities with Sagittarius, so that there's a lack of similarity or a lack of ability to sort of see each other or recognize each other, because they just don't share a lot in common. So there's an initial, if things that are like kind of gravitate to each other or flow together more easily, things that are different have a harder time coming together.
Yeah, that's actually a tough one for me, and I carry both of those signs prominently. But I feel like one of the first things that I think of with those two is the love of like nature. And they may be different ways of loving nature, but Taurus is like a very earthy nature. I don't know any better words to use, but I associate that a lot with Taurus. And then I look at Sagittarius, who, again, going back to kind of like the hunter, half animal, feels comfortable in nature as well. So I think they share that quality.
One of the things I said in the Libra episode, that Taurus is like a garden and Libra is like an art gallery.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
I like the art
They both
gallery
get something out of being in nature, right? Like Taurus gets a lot out of being in like, for example, the garden, they enjoy being there. They enjoy the sights and sounds and the smells and the kind of like immediate impact of the garden, like its beauty and the feeling you get from being in it, and Sagittarius might be looking at the plants and going, oh, that's a rare blah blah plant from that comes from like all the way over in Asia, and they're interested in like oh, this is like inspiring me
information
being here, or like going camping, for example. Like Taurus might love that back to the roots, back to a simple way of living when they go camping, that kind of like, this is so earthy and like grounded. And Sagittarius likes the adventure of it and likes the sort of like how different it is to their everyday life, and they enjoy that kind of that sort of alien experience in some ways.
Yeah, I think Taurus would have an issue, or Sagittarius would have an issue of like needing, like Taurus likes tending to a garden and like going every day and just like watering the plants and the regularity and being grounded and how you come back to something that you're just taking care of on a day-to-day basis. And I think part of the tension there initially would be Sagittarius would get bored with that because it doesn't present a lot of like new stuff that you're having to do the same thing over and over again. But if you presented that in like Sagittarius being able to like travel around to different places where it's seeing new gardens or parks or camping or something like that, then that would make sense, because there, as you said, Rob, there would be a sense of adventure there, which is very important for Sag.
Yeah, we haven't used that word yet, I think, adventure, but that is a really good keyword for Sagittarius. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Reminds me a little bit of
Hold on, what were you going to say, Ashley, before I interrupted?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Don't want to lose my train of thought, but I was kind of thinking like Taurus, you guys mentioned bringing the senses to them, like they get to experience physically all these senses in the garden, sounds, smells, the touch of the grass, all of those things. And Sag also has this like deep connection or things that they feel, but it's like they're inspired by like, oh, like you said, oh, look at this flower. The way that it's structured reminds me of this like idea, this bigger idea.
Of the idea of like the golden mean or something like that.
Yeah,
like
exactly. Yeah. Like I'm intellectually making this like, oh my gosh, this is how life is brought together. Whereas Taurus is like, I'm just soaking it in physically. I'm feeling it.
Well, Taurus would be like, no, just smell the flower. It smells good.
Yeah.
Like that.
Like stop trying to overthink it.
Yeah. You don't need to intellectualize it.
Yes, that's a really great contrast between the signs. I think we've kind of nailed it there, Ashley. Yeah. Like that, there's a practical and immediate interest for Taurus, and Sagittarius focuses on things that are far off and like more lofty, and that can be a clash sometimes. I have a friend who's a Taurus, and we both are very into video games, but our tastes in video games are very different. Like he likes old video games he remembers from his childhood, and he loves to just play them over and over again. And he likes simple games, like he likes the old Nintendo games because there's just 2 buttons. It's nice and simple.
Oh, and classic. And
yeah. And I like really like I like some like complex strategy game that's like very huge and like you sort of slowly expanding across the world. And you can see that sort of difference in like, like I like things that are sort of a high-mindedness to it. And he likes something that's more simple. We share that love of games because, and you can look at that from terms of the benefics, like Taurus, ruled by Venus, loves fun and games, and Sagittarius, ruled by Jupiter, also likes to have a good time and have fun. But they go about it in a different way. They have very different philosophy, very different psychology, but there's a shared kind of like interest in having fun, having a good time, making sure that other people are enjoying themselves. They're kind of, there's like a, what do you call it? Like a hedonistic kind of streak to both of them.
Yeah, they like the enjoyment of good things, but they might have different preferences about the way they go about enjoying good things. Like I think of like food tastes, like Taurus, for example, when it finds like something it likes in terms of food, it'll go back to that over and over again, and it finds joy in familiarity and in the familiarity of knowing what they like and having very distinct, definitive like tastes on what they like, and sometimes having problems going outside of that because they worry about if they tried something new, they might not like it when they could have had that thing that they originally had, which is something a lot of the fixed signs share in common, but especially Taurus versus Sagittarius, wanting to be adventurous with its tastes and like trying different foods from like different cultures or different places. Or maybe if it had an option between trying something that they've had, 10 times over the past week versus trying a new food that they've never had, that they would opt for the new food.
Yeah. Sagittarius seeks out difference and seeks out the unfamiliar, and it enjoys experiencing things that are really alien or really strange, because they just love that. It's like an amazing learning experience and being transported, you know. But Taurus, really wants to stick with what it knows, and it's sort of nervous about the idea of change and novelty and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And they almost both like to overindulge sometimes on those things. They're like very different. Like you said, with Taurus, always going for that same food. They will gladly overindulge in that same item over and over again. And Sag will gladly overindulge in just over expanding themselves. So I think they hold that like gluttonous quality and indulgence quality.
Right.
Yeah. I think this is a bit of an esoteric take, but I'm a Sagittarius. I'm going to go with that.
Yes.
In William Lilly's Christian Astrology, he describes like the body shapes of different planets, like what they look like, and both Venus and Jupiter, he says they're like prone to being a bit fleshy, a little bit like kind of rotund, perhaps because they have that like hedonistic kind of quality. They just love their food and drink. But Sagittarius wants to try the new Japanese restaurant that opened around the corner. But Taurus wants to just, have that good old home cooking that they're familiar with, or whatever it might be.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Speaking of home cooking, that might be a good transition to the last sign to contrast, which is Cancer, which is the other sign that is in aversion to Sagittarius. And so Cancer is ruled by the moon. It's a cardinal sign. It's a water sign, and it's nocturnal/feminine. So that one's even more, I think, a little bit more different than Taurus in some ways. And I think it's like one of the contrasts here is external versus internal, or what's the psychological associations in modern times of like extroversion versus introversion. Introvert versus extrovert, of it maybe more of a tendency for Cancer to be more introverted versus Sagittarius being so much more extroverted sign, personality wise.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a contrast there. There's a very inward looking component to Cancer, and they sort of feel their way through life, and Sagittarius is very outward, very open, very like and sort of dives into things. There's a kind of a little bit of a defensive quality to Cancer, sort of a little bit similar to Scorpio. They have a shell, and they sort of protect their inner, that they protect that watery nature inside of them. So they're a bit more closed off, and Sagittarius is very loud and proud and like out there, like here I am world, and maybe Cancer might admire that in Sagittarius, that earnestness and openness. But Cancer can't always feel free to be so open and so earnest and trusting. They want to sort of protect themselves a little bit, the shell of the crab. Yeah.
And like empathy, I feel like, is a strong Cancer or water keyword. And not saying that Sagittarius doesn't have empathy, but that's something that we have to be like conscious of having, because we get so set in our ways and what we're doing is right, whereas Cancer may pick up more on like, well, this is like maybe hurting somebody by expressing this way, and Sag is like, I don't care, I'm gonna just say it anyways. And then I'm also thinking about the moon as like a guiding light of the night, and it guides people in darkness. But then Jupiter, in a way, even though it's not as visual or you can't see it as well, it's still a guiding light in a way. Like, as the teachers of the zodiac, we want to guide you on where you could potentially go. And the moon does that in a way.
Yeah.
There is that one shared quality they have, well, somewhat shared, that in the Cancer is the exaltation of Jupiter. So there is so Jupiter does well in Cancer, it's the other than Sagittarius and Pisces, it's the next best place for Jupiter to be in the zodiac. So there's something about Cancer that the Jupiter thrives in that space, which is interesting to think about.
Yeah.
And maybe that has something to do with the earnestness and openness of Sagittarius. There's like, because Cancer is very heart-led. They're a heartfelt sign, and they make decisions based on the heart. Like as in the old feel, like the feeling in your chest that you have. That's where they're going to make decisions. Particularly Cancer rising is going to make decisions based on, what their heart is telling them. And Jupiter has this this jovial quality, this like earnestness, this earnestness, and an openness. They're opening the heart. They're not afraid of bearing their heart for people and wearing their heart on their sleeve. So there's something there, I think, about that heart-led nature of Cancer that Jupiter actually does well when it's there.
Yeah. There's maybe connected with the exaltation thing, there's like a life-affirming quality for both of them, or something important about Cancer and supporting life in some way. Sometimes we think about, in the Cancer episode, we talked about like nurturing as a Cancer trait and what nurturing actually is, and what it's like to like take care of somebody, or to have the impulse to cook for somebody, to like cook food for somebody, and the nourishing quality of that, to nourish something. And that's a major focus of Cancer. And while that's not a major focus for Sagittarius necessarily, there might be more of a broader sense of that which is nourishing for the soul, as opposed to that which is like nourishing for the soul or the mind, with Sagittarius, versus for Cancer that which is nourishing for the body.
Another thing came up for me. Sorry, Ashley. I'll just quickly mention this. In William Lilly, again, I keep mentioning Lilly today for some reason. In his book Christian Astrology, he describes
from the 17th century.
17th century astrologer, yeah. He wrote the first textbook in English, a complete textbook about astrology in English. He describes the personalities of the signs, and he says something about the moon that always stayed with me. It lives in the back of my mind rent-free about the moon, which is, he says that that lunar people, they desire to live free of the cares of this world. Like they don't want to be troubled. And I think there's a similar freedom-loving quality there with Sagittarius. Like, I think there's something about Cancer that might want to just pack up and live in a van and just go out and like not be bothered with all this pressures that are put on them by society. And I think there's another shared quality there with Sagittarius, is that desire to be free of burden and free of stress and free of worry. Sorry, Ashley, I keep talking over you. I'm terribly sorry. It's my Aries rising coming through.
These ideas are just coming.
Yeah.
I was just, it's not like a big one, but I was just thinking that Cancer is a little like more forgiving, because they have that like nurturing quality, and they want to help people grow and evolve in like a nurturing way. And they're just more forgiving. And I feel like Sagittarius is a lot less forgiving, because they have that independent quality to themselves, that they expect everyone to be like independent. Like, why do you need this person to cook for you? And Cancer's like, well, I want to cook for this person because I care about them, and this is affection for me. And Sag may see it as like, well, they're a grown adult, like they can do these things for themselves. So that's a big difference I see.
Yeah. Sure. Less compromising, less, and that sort of fiery firebrand nature of Jupiter is like more scornful, and if it feels that something's, that sense of justice you mentioned earlier as well, Ashley, about Sagittarius, that yes, if they're not so ready to forgive, like they might think of themselves as being like merciful, but they also have like, there's also this sort of like, let's throw them into hell kind of like side to Sagittarius as well,
Let's teach them a little bit more.
Yeah.
One last thing I was thinking of was just that a contrast and an almost incompatibility between those two signs is that Cancer might have a reputation of being more of a homebody, versus Sagittarius is more like the traveler, the explorer, the adventurer, and in that way they have a almost sort of conflict or tension there in terms of the direction that they would both gravitate towards if just left to their default, their usual devices.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think given the opportunity, a Sag would love to go explore and go witness new things, different things. Whereas Cancer probably prefers the familiar and something that's safe and secure. There's an issue with security with Cancer, concern about security. Whereas Sagittarius is less worried about that. They're more bold. I don't think Sagittarius is even consider that someone might try and attack them or hurt them, or it's the last thing on your mind. So given like you said, Chris, given the opportunity, where would they go? What would they do? Cancer might go home.
Mm-hmm. And I like the word familiar for Cancer, like family, familiar. And Sagittarius almost is most comfortable with the unfamiliar because it expands them. And Cancer feels comfort and security in familiarity. So I like that word.
Yes.
Yeah. And risk taking, and like Sagittarius is less risk adverse and more prone towards taking risks. Versus Cancer tends to be a little bit more cautious in terms of risk taking.
Absolutely.
And sidestep the crab, whereas Sag is going forward.
Which more direct, both literally and sometimes also personality wise. Like there's a directness to Sagittarius where there's might be more of an indirectness to Cancer.
Yeah, Sag is often said to be blunt, or like just to say exactly what's on their mind, and that might offend people around them,
Right, that might hurt Cancer's feelings if you're like too blunt.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Sag
I think
doesn't even know.
Yeah, if any sign's going to like take what Sagittarius says in like the worst way and like and feel like their feelings have been hurt or they've been insulted by a Sagittarius, it might be Cancer. Yeah.
For sure. All right, you two, I think looking at the signs of the zodiac, as long as we don't do anything crazy like add a 13th sign or something like that, I think that is all 12. And we have successfully talked about Sagittarius in general, and then we've also successfully compared it to the other signs for the most part pretty thoroughly, I think, at this point, right?
I think so. I think we did a great job.
Yeah, this was amazing. Thank you both. Is there anything before we wrap up and mention our websites and everything else that you want to mention, or anything that we forgot to mention or that we should have covered or that we'll like kick ourselves for as soon as we stop recording?
I think I've got everything that I wanted to say out. But yeah, it's been a great conversation.
Yeah.
I actually do have something I kind of want to add from my notes,
Okay.
or a few little things. I don't know if you guys are familiar with tarot at all.
Yeah,
a little bit.
But the Temperance card or the art card are associated with Sag. And it's like the art of alchemy, basically. It's like taking the good and the bad and creating something out of it. So that's something that I think Sag is very good at, is that alchemical process of taking both the good and the bad and creating something beneficial from that. And speaking of alchemy, my favorite book growing up as a kid was The Alchemist. And I really I really felt close to the character taking a journey. He was like on this physical journey, but throughout this process of the journey, he actually learned that it's not about where you're going. It's not your destination. It's the actual journey and the travels, everything that you're encountering on the road to that goal. And that's just like such a strong Sagittarius story to me.
Totally.
And then like one last thing, going with the bow and arrow, the archer. I am an archer myself. I do archery and I'm just naturally like a champ at it. And thinking about it, let me actually see if I have a note here. Sorry, guys. But essentially, it's like using tension, creating tension, and using that tension with focus in a way. Like we talked about, Sagittarius loves creating disruption and tension between people, but using the tension of the bow to like actually go further. And there is like a goal and a purpose to this tension. And once that's released, then we want to pick up another one. We want to keep on with those goals. So I just really like the whole Archer connection to it.
Totally.
That's fantastic that you're an archer in astrology and in real life as well. I love that.
Thank you. My Archer father taught me, who's a Sag as well. So I love it.
It's too perfect.
So, yes, that was actually a funny point that your father is, so you're a sun sign Sag. Your father is a sun sign Sag, and then I think you said your mother's Sag rising?
Yes.
Okay, that's really funny in terms of the repetition of family placements. Then Rob, didn't you say your father was a Sag?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, my father's Sagittarius, and I think he also has a Gemini moon as well, just like me. And I similarly have Sagittarius on Gemini moon. So yeah, there's something going on there.
Yeah, there's something to that. Just because like I said in the last episode, I'm a Scorpio sun, and then my mom and dad are both Scorpio suns.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, that's very interesting. As soon as I heard that your fathers, first of all, just matched the sun, it's something to look into.
Mm-hmm. The synastry charts, when you do the overlay, is very, very cool to see. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and seeing the patterns within your family and seeing, I am both of my parents.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this episode. Where can we find out more information or tell me about your work and what you have coming up? Ashley, what are you doing? What are your plans for the future?
My plans for the future is to be more accessible online with astrology things. So I do have a website that you can access. And then I also have an Instagram that I like to talk about astrology on here and there.
Nice. What's your Instagram handle?
It is the High Priestess.
Okay.
We may have to post it because there's a lot of little underscores and stuff in there.
Okay. Sure. And your URL for your domain is ashleyrparis.com, right?
That's right. And I also want to point out that it's kind of funny that I'm the High Priestess on Instagram and Sagittarius is the priestess. So I'll be easy to find.
Awesome. Cool. I'll put a link to that. And then Rob, what about you? What are you working on?
Yeah, so at the moment I'm still doing horary astrology readings. I'm open. My books are open for horary astrology readings. If you want to get a reading from me, a horary astrology reading, you can go to my website, which is oldschoolastrology.com. I'm also working with you, Chris, on the early stages of our course where we're going to be teaching horary astrology to people. And we recorded our first video lecture just a couple of days ago. So apart from my readings in horary, I'll also be focusing on preparing the course materials for that course, which is super exciting.
Yeah, and I'm also so excited about that because we've been planning this for like a couple of years now, and we finally just recorded the first lecture just 2 days ago. So it's the horary astrology course, which is available at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And what we're doing is I had an older course that was recorded about a decade ago that is up and is available right now. And then we're going to be basically adding new lectures to and slowly reviving that course over the next few months. But people can already sign up for that if they want to get early access to it as we release those videos. And then we'll basically just grandfather in whoever's already signed up once we raise the price eventually, once we finish the lecture series sometime next year.
Yeah, so you can get in early for a cheaper price now. And get access to that new content once it's up. Yeah, very exciting. And we've been working on it and talking about it for a long time. And it's just a great feeling to actually be in the process of doing it. It's like we've mentioned in the talk today, like Sagittarius is really great about ideas, but then actually making it happen is another thing. So it's good to have someone with some Saturnian placements, strong Saturn in their chart with Chris here to make this a reality, make the dream a reality, So in terms of my socials, I'm very active on Twitter. My handle's at oldschoolastro. And I'm also on Instagram at oldschoolastrology.
Cool. Awesome. And I'll put links to both of your websites in the description, either below this video on YouTube or on the Astrology Podcast website for the entry for this episode. But otherwise, I think that's it. So thank you both for joining me today. This is amazing.
Thank you so much, Chris. Just really enjoyed the conversation. It's so nice to meet you, Ashley, and talk astrology with you. I just had a great time.
Yeah. So good to meet you. And I feel like we had such an expansive conversation. So I hope everyone gets something great out of this too.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Leave inspired and full of high ideas.
Aim high, everybody.
All right.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast. That's it for this episode. So we'll see you again next time. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Mimi Stargazer, and Jean-Marie Kaplan. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through our page on patreon.com. In exchange, you can get access to bonus content that's only available to patrons of the podcast, such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the monthly forecast episodes, our monthly auspicious elections podcast, or another exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, we have a list of recommended astrologers at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrologers on the list are friends of the podcast that have been featured in different episodes over the years, and they have different specialties such as natal astrology, electional astrology, synastry, rectification, or horary astrology. You can get a 10% discount when you book a consultation with one of the astrologers on our list by using the promo code AstrologyPodcast. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called Astro Gold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. You can get a print copy of the book through Amazon or other online retailers, or there's an ebook version available through Google Books. I also recently published a new translation of the anthology of the 2nd century astrologer Vedius Valens, which is one of the most important sources for understanding the practice of ancient astrology. You can find that by searching for Vedius Valens, the anthology on Amazon or other online book retailers. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts, as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. I also recently launched a new course there called the Birth Time Rectification course, where I teach students how to figure out your birth time using astrology when the birth time is either unknown or uncertain. You can find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. Each year, the podcast releases a set of astrology calendar posters for the coming year, and we've just released our 2023 planetary alignments and planetary movements posters, which are now available on our website at theastrologypodcast.com/store. There you can also pick up our 2023 electional astrology report, where Lisa Scheim and I went through the next 12 months, and we picked out the single most auspicious date for each month using the principles of electional astrology. You can get that at theastrologypodcast.com/2023 report. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine, which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com. Finally, thanks also to the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is happening May 25th through the 29th, 2023, just outside of Seattle. This year's conference is going to be a hybrid conference where you can either attend online or in person. Find out more information at norwac.net.